what happens when silence becomes the most dangerous sound of all. Before anyone in the village could explain when it had begun, they described the same moment in different words. A spoon trembling in a teacup before dawn, a wardrobe door softly rattling though the floorboards were still, a dog lifting its head at nothing, then whining toward the cellar. At first, those details sounded too small to belong to a real emergency. In another place, they might have been dismissed as nerves, age, weather, or imagination. But in the Black Forest, where sound usually arrived with a recognizable shape, the rush of wind through spruce, the distant cut of logging saws, the church bell drifting through fog, this was something else. It had no clear source, no direction, no mercy. It did not interrupt silence. It wore silence like a mask. The village of Haldenkirch lay in a narrow fold of the Schwarzwald, hidden between granite ridges and dense pine slopes that kept the light thin long after sunrise. In winter, mist settled there as if it had chosen the place and refused to leave. In summer, the air held the cool scent of moss, wet bark, and old stone. Visitors often said the village seemed preserved outside time. The residents used a different word, trapped. By late October, the first official reports had already been filed in Freiburg and ignored. Noise complaint, disturbance of the peace, mental health concern, domestic incident. The language changed depending on which office received the call, but the pattern remained. Men and women over the age of 35 had stopped sleeping. Marriages that had lasted decades cracked open over nothing. A retired postman struck his brother over a garden fence dispute. Neither of them could later explain. A baker threw 3 trays of fresh bread into the street because the ovens, he said, were speaking to him in the walls. An elderly violin teacher locked herself in her bathroom for 14 hours with towels stuffed under the door, insisting the humming was trying to find a way in. The younger residents heard none of it. That detail was what finally unsettled Mayor Matthias Reber enough to act outside procedure. He was not a man inclined toward melodrama. At 62, broad-shouldered and cautious, he had spent most of his public life solving ordinary rural problems. Bus routes, winter road budgets, school repairs, arguments over property lines. He believed in paperwork, in county channels, in waiting for professional confirmation before using words like crisis. But 2 things had happened within the same week that made those habits feel suddenly useless. The first was a fight in the village square on a Thursday afternoon, under a sky the color of dirty wool. A woman named Petra Kessler, 47, had accused the pharmacist of hiding speakers behind the clock tower. 3 men tried to calm her. One of them lost 2 teeth. The second event was quieter. Reber's own wife, Clara, woke him at 3:18 in the morning and asked with terrible calm whether he could hear the engine under the house. There was no engine. By then, the local police had begun treating Haldenkirch with visible impatience. A district doctor suggested stress contagion. Someone in Stuttgart mentioned infrasound from forestry equipment, but the logging schedule did not match the worst episodes. And besides, the younger forestry workers reported no symptoms at all. Reber stopped asking for permission and began calling specialists directly. That was how Sabine Keller came into the story. She arrived from Stuttgart on a Monday morning in a dark estate car with road salt crusted along the doors and 3 cases of equipment secured in the back. She was 50 years old, tall, spare, and unsentimental in the way of people who had spent many years being correct in rooms full of louder voices. Her work had taken her from opera houses with flawed acoustics to industrial zones near airports, from legal disputes over construction noise to environmental assessments for rail lines and wind farms. She was known for precision, for patience, and for refusing theatrical conclusions before the numbers justified them. She was also known, though only in smaller circles, for having left another career long ago. In her 20s and 30s, she had worked around studios, touring halls and rehearsal spaces in the music world. Years of beauty, exhaustion, exhaustion, and permanent damage. The consequence followed her still. A thin, private tinnitus lived in her ears like electrical dust. Some days it was no more than a faint thread. Some days it was a blade. That was why, when Mayor Reber told her over the phone that the village was haunted by a sound only certain people could hear, she almost refused the assignment. She disliked mysteries that encouraged projection. She disliked frightened clients who wanted spiritual answers from technical instruments. More than anything, she disliked the possibility that her own hearing might betray her in a place already balanced on paranoia. But desperation has its own acoustics. She heard it in the pauses between Reba's sentences, heard it in the strain under his politeness, heard it when he said almost too quietly that 3 families were preparing to leave their homes and an old man had nearly set fire to his shed trying to burn whatever was below it. So she came. The first thing Sabine noticed in Haldenkirch was not a sound, but an absence. Even with the mayor waiting in the square beside the fountain, even with a delivery van idling near the bakery and damp leaves scraping along the cobblestones, the village seemed to be listening to itself. Windows were closed, though the day was mild. Conversation stopped when she passed. A church bell rang from the ridge above, and for a moment the whole square appeared to relax, as if ordinary noise still possessed the authority to keep worse things away. Reba shook her hand and did not waste time. "We have had stress before," he said. "Storms, flooding, layoffs. This is different." Sabine glanced around the square. When did it start? No one agrees. 6 weeks, maybe 8. At first only at night. Now all day, on and off. And only older residents? He gave a small, humorless nod. "My deputy is 29. She says we are all poisoning ourselves with gossip. My wife says she would pay anything to spend 10 minutes in my deputy's head." Sabine crouched near the fountain. The basin was circular, carved from weather-darkened stone, fed by a thin iron pipe that sent a modest stream into the center. The water should have been moving randomly from the current and the wind. Instead, once every few seconds, the surface tightened. Not much, just enough to disturb the reflection of the timbered facades and the grey sky. A ripple formed, vanished, and formed again with a discipline that did not look natural. "Did you see that?" Reba asked. Sabine did not answer immediately. She watched another pattern appear. A faint tremor passed across the water in concentric lines, clean enough to resemble a demonstration in a laboratory tank. "You said this happens often?" she asked. "People started noticing last week." "Who first?" The mayor hesitated. "A child." That made her look up. "A child who cannot hear the sound," he said. She only asked her mother why the fountain was shaking when nothing else was moving. Sabine stood very still after that. Around them, Haldenkirch held its breath behind lace curtains and old glass. Somewhere up the slope, a chainsaw started, then cut off abruptly. The wind moved through the pines with a low, natural murmur, but beneath it, or perhaps within it, there came something she could not yet name. Not quite a tone, not quite pressure, more like a deep interior loosening, as if the air itself had briefly forgotten how to remain still. Her jaw tightened. She told herself it was fatigue from the drive, or the familiar deceit of tinnitus adapting to a new landscape. Yet the sensation did not stay inside her ears. She felt it in her molars, in the bridge of her nose, in the hollow under her ribs. For the first time since leaving Stuttgart, Sabine wondered whether Mayor Reba had not exaggerated the situation at all. Perhaps he had done the opposite. Perhaps language had simply failed before the phenomenon reached him. "Set me up in the square," she said quietly. "I want long-range microphones, vibration sensors, ground coupling, water analysis, everything." Reba nodded with visible relief, but Sabine was no longer looking at him. She was looking at the fountain. The water had begun to tremble again. Only now the pattern was no longer intermittent. It was settling into a rhythm. By the second morning, Sabine Keller understood why the residents of Haldenkirch had begun speaking more softly, as though the village itself were injured. The hum had not announced itself in any dramatic way. There had been no cinematic jolt in the night, no shattered glass, no sudden collapse into panic. Instead, it moved in and out of the edges of perception with the patience of something that did not need to hurry. At 4:12 in the morning, while the guest house radiator clicked and the wind brushed the eaves, she woke with the distinct impression that someone had parked a diesel engine somewhere beneath the floorboards. She lay still, one hand over the blanket, listening. The sound was not exactly audible. It was more intimate than that. It seemed to occupy bone before air, body before room. When she sat up, it vanished. Or rather, it seemed to. Sabine had lived too long with damaged hearing to trust the clean division between sound and memory. Tinnitus had taught her that the ear was not a passive instrument. It improvised. It filled absence. It mistook fatigue for tone and stress for vibration. In her 20s, when she had still believed that proximity to music was a kind of blessing, she had spent nights standing too close to stage monitors in rehearsal halls thick with cigarette smoke and stale cables. In her 30s, she had begun waking to a high electric whistle that no one else could hear. The diagnosis had not surprised her. The permanence had. She had adjusted in the practical ways people do. No concerts without protection, no unnecessary headphones, fewer crowded restaurants. She learned to sleep with white noise, then later without it. She built a life around measurable sound rather than emotional sound. Numbers were kinder, frequencies did not pity her, and they did not lie. That private discipline had made her effective, but it had also made her cautious in ways few clients understood. Sabine rarely trusted her first sensory impression of anything. She trusted patterns, correlations, instrument readouts, repeatability. That was what had brought her professional life from the chaos of the music industry into engineering and environmental consultation. If a city wanted to know whether a new tram line exceeded acceptable noise thresholds, she could prove it. If a developer denied that a ventilation system was generating subharmonic vibration through residential walls, she could show the resonance on paper. Even when companies hated her conclusions, they could not argue with the precision of them. Halden Kirk, however, had already begun by insulting precision. At breakfast, the guest house dining room smelled of rye bread, butter, and burnt coffee. The owner, Frau Brenner, kept glancing toward the curtained windows as if expecting someone to appear outside them. She was in her late 50s, with reddened hands and the brittle efficiency of a woman who had spent half her life serving strangers without trusting any of them. "You slept?" she asked, placing a basket of bread on Sabine's table. "Enough." "That means no." Sabine gave a faint, non-committal smile. Frau Brenner looked toward the empty corner where an old radio sat unplugged on a sideboard. "My husband says it comes strongest before dawn. Then around midday, when the fog stays low." "Does he hear it now?" "He went to his brother's farm yesterday and did not come back." The statement was delivered with such flatness that it took a moment to reveal its actual meaning. "He left because of the noise. Because I asked him to." Frau Brenner folded a napkin, unfolded it, then folded it again. "He has not slept in 10 days. Last night he accused me of turning something on and off in the cellar. We do not have a cellar." There was no melodrama in her face. That, more than anything, unnerved Sabine. Fear was expected. Exhaustion was expected. But this weary administrative tone, as if madness had become another household task to be managed, suggested a village already moving from crisis into adaptation. Sabine finished her coffee, signed the breakfast receipt, and carried her field case across the square into the thin grey morning. The fountain stood where she had left it, dark with cold, the water surface calm except for the occasional disciplined tremor that disturbed the reflected windows. The equipment van from Stuttgart had arrived before dawn. Her assistant, Jonas Heller, was unloading sensor cases with the resigned energy of a man who had not expected to spend his Tuesday in a mist-covered forest village full of sleepless people. Jonas was 28, technically gifted, and too young to hide his skepticism, as well as he believed he could. He had followed Sabine from a research lab to private consultancy 2 years earlier, after a dispute with a university supervisor over manipulated data in a transport study. He admired Sabine because she was ruthless with bad methodology and indifferent to academic vanity. Sabine valued him because he could build a recording array from scratch in difficult weather and rarely wasted words. He looked up from a coil of cable and nodded toward the square. Still no obvious industrial source. I did a perimeter check at dawn. Logging machinery is quiet this side of the ridge. Any complaints already? He gave a dry half laugh. 3 before 8 o'clock. One old man asked whether we were here to fix the church organ. Another said if we shut down the sawmill, he would personally send us the unemployment bills. Good morning to you too then. Jonas lowered his voice. Sabine, are we treating this as a real acoustic event or as a social event with acoustic features? It was the sort of question she appreciated because it was honest and impolite in the right direction. We treat it as measurable until it refuses to be measurable, she said. And if it already has, she glanced at the fountain, then we work harder. They set the square up as a temporary field lab. Jonas mounted highly sensitive microphones at 3 elevations around the plaza, shielding them against wind and damp. Sabine installed contact sensors on the fountain's stone lip, laser vibrometry on a tripod, and a compact geophone array near the church path to register ground resonance. A portable data rack hummed quietly under a weather cover, its status lights blinking in obedient green rows. Villagers watched from windows and doorways. No one came close enough to help. By mid-morning, the fog had thinned into a low, drifting veil, exposing the dark slopes around Haldenkirch. The forest rose steeply on all sides, black fir and silver trunks layered over granite and old logging roads. It was an enclosed place, acoustically complex even before any unknown factor entered it. Valleys could carry sound in deceptive ways. Stone reflected certain frequencies and absorbed others. Wind shear could bend noise until it seemed to rise from the wrong direction. Under ordinary circumstances, Sabine would have welcomed the challenge. But she could not shake the sense that something in Haldenkirch was already one step ahead of the tools meant to define it. At 11, the first long capture session finished. Jonas transferred the files. Sabine checked waveform data, broadband frequency distribution, wind contamination, transient peaks. There was nothing extraordinary in the airborne channels. Village ambience, footsteps, bird movement in the canopy, a van on the east road, a dog barking twice and then not again. The microphones, perfect and obedient, had captured a world in which Haldenkirch's nightmare did not exist. Jonas leaned over the monitor. "That's impossible." "No," Sabine said. "It's worse than impossible. It's clean." She hated clean data in dirty situations. Clean data meant a mission, and a mission could come from the environment, the instrumentation, or the assumptions built into the test. Somewhere, something had escaped the frame. Then the fountain trembled, not violently, not enough for a casual passerby to react. But Sabine saw the surface draw itself into a pattern again, a tight, repeating geometry that lasted 2 seconds, disappeared and returned. She set down her headphones and crossed to the basin, crouching low enough for her breath to cloud the water. "What is it?" Jonas asked from behind her. "Look at the intervals," he frowned. "Could be traffic resonance or someone underground pumping water." "Then it should drift." Another tremor passed through the basin. The ripples formed in near-perfect concentric order, evenly spaced, with a regularity that felt less like fluid disturbance than instruction. Sabine unpacked a high-frame camera and positioned it above the fountain. Then she placed 2 floating markers on the water surface and synchronized the visual capture with the contact sensors on the stone rim. For 20 minutes they recorded. Wind shifted. A church door opened and closed. Somewhere nearby, someone shouted angrily in a house. Through it all, the pattern recurred, not randomly, not in response to visible movement, but at mathematically consistent intervals. When the first analysis finished, Sabine stared at the graph in silence. The microphones had nothing. The air had yielded no verifiable signal, yet the water displacement and stone vibration together described a low-frequency wave pattern with astonishing precision. Narrowband, repeating, almost machine-perfect. Jonas read over her shoulder. "That can't be natural." Sabine did not answer immediately, because in that instant, beneath the fountain, beneath the wind, beneath the village's exhausted quiet, she felt it again, that same interior loosening, the suggestion of a deep, distant pressure pressing against her teeth. Not loud, not even fully hearable, but present. Her first thought was professional. Her second was private and far more dangerous. What if the village was right? What if she was beginning to hear it too? She stepped back from the monitor and removed her glasses, pressing her fingers against her eyes until color bloomed in the dark. She could not afford uncertainty this early. Not from the mayor, not from the village, certainly not from herself. When she opened her eyes again, Mayor Ribert was standing at the edge of the square, hat in hand, looking older than he had the day before. "Engineer Keller," he said, "there's something else you should know." Sabine studied his face. What happened? He hesitated, as if weighing whether speaking would make the fact more real. "It was only adults at first," he said. "That much is still true. They are the only ones who hear it." He glanced toward the guest house, then back to the fountain. "But this morning, A 16-year-old boy tried to cut open the wall of his bedroom because he said he could feel something moving inside it. By noon, the village had begun to move with the jagged rhythm of a place trying not to panic in public. The boy's name was Lucas Voss, 16, narrow-shouldered, pale from too many hours indoors, with the exhausted alertness of someone who had not slept properly in days. Sabine found him at the small medical office beside the old fire station, sitting on an examination chair with a bandage wrapped around his left palm. He had cut himself on plaster and wood lath after driving a kitchen knife into the wall beside his bed. His mother stood near the sink with her coat still on, arms folded so tightly across her chest that her knuckles had gone white. "He does not hear it," she said before Sabine could ask. "That is what everyone keeps saying. He does not hear anything, but he says the wall is breathing." Lucas did not look at his mother. He stared at the floor tiles. Sabine kept her voice low. "Tell me exactly what you felt." He lifted his head, and the embarrassment in his face was almost worse than fear. "It starts in the bed frame," he said, "very light, like when a truck passes on the road, but there is no truck. Then it comes through the pillow. Not a noise, more like pressure, like someone pushing a finger from the other side. In the wall." He nodded. "You said moving." "It changed places," he swallowed. "First near the window, then near the wardrobe, then behind my head. I thought maybe there was a pipe, but there isn't. I know there isn't." His mother turned sharply toward the window, ashamed of the whole conversation. "He has school exams. Everyone is upset. This village is making people dramatic." Lucas's expression closed instantly. Sabine recognized the damage of being disbelieved. It often mattered as much as the disturbance itself. "When did it begin?" she asked. "3 nights ago, only in my room, not downstairs." That interested her. She asked for the house address, promised nothing, and left before the interview could harden into accusation. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone and pine resin. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the ridge above Haldenkirch, a dark cut of forest where the logging roads vanished into the trees. The village square lay subdued under a weak afternoon light. Her equipment remained in place around the fountain, patient and mute. Jonas was waiting beside the data station with 2 coffees and a face that meant bad news. "The second capture is the same," he said. "Nothing useful in the airborne recordings. Some low-end environmental wash, but nothing that explains this." Sabine took the coffee without drinking it. "What about the contact sensors?" He handed her a tablet. "That's the problem. The stone lip of the fountain is showing periodic excitation at the same interval as the water pattern. Very clean, too clean." She studied the graph. The signal rose and fell in regular waves, narrow and disciplined, like an instruction repeated by a patient machine. It was deep enough to sit at the edge of conventional auditory relevance, but its regularity made chance increasingly implausible. "Could this be instrumentation feedback?" Jonas asked. "If it were, the timings would drift when we repositioned the array." And they didn't. "No," Sabine looked toward the church, then beyond it to the enclosing hills. "It is coming through structure, not air. Or it is coupling into surfaces in a way the microphones can't register from open space." Jonas made a face, which is just a polite scientific way of saying the village may not be imagining things. The village is not imagining the fountain, but the adults hearing it and the younger people not. Sabine did not answer at once. She had been asking herself the same question since dawn. Age-related hearing loss usually narrowed the range of perception. It did not selectively unlock some secret band of torment, unless the real mechanism was not ordinary hearing at all. Unless what people called a hum was only the conscious translation of pressure, resonance, or bone conduction. Unless the body itself was acting as a flawed decoder. And if that was true, her own damaged hearing no longer made her only vulnerable. It made her useful. She hated the thought. By 1 o'clock, she and Jonas had moved beyond the square. They worked in a widening radius through Haldenkirch's lanes and houses, carrying portable sensors, a laser vibrometer, and a compact resonance hammer for wall testing. Sabine logged floor construction, pipe routes, elevation changes, and proximity to bedrock exposures. In one house, a retired mechanic insisted the hum gathered strongest inside his pantry, as though glass jars could attract it. In another, a widow said it came through the staircase only after sunset. 2 residents shut their doors as soon as they saw the equipment. A third demanded to know whether Stuttgart had sent Sabine to fabricate evidence against the timber cooperative. There it was again, the logging syndicate. The Schwarzwald Holzgemeinschaft employed nearly a third of Haldenkirch directly or indirectly. Saw crews, truck drivers, equipment maintenance, mill labor, contracts for seasonal thinning, resin transport, road clearing. In a small village, economic power traveled quickly into every conversation. If the investigation pointed toward industrial activity, even wrongly, people would defend their livelihoods before they defended their sleep. Sabine noted the tension and kept working. Lucas Voss's house sat at the north edge of the village, half-timbered and renovated badly enough for new plaster to conceal old logic. His room was upstairs beneath a steep roof. The bed stood against an interior wall, just where he had said. Sabine sent Jonas downstairs to check pipe routes while she placed 3 contact sensors along the plaster and another on the bed frame itself. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the pillow shifted. Not visibly enough for anyone else to notice in passing, but enough for the mounted sensor to register a tiny synchronized tremor. Sabine stared at the waveform as it bloomed across the tablet screen, a repeating low-frequency event, faint but unmistakable. She moved the sensor 10 centimeters to the left. The amplitude dropped. She moved it higher, near the section of wall Lucas had cut open. The signal strengthened. "Jonas," she called. He came upstairs carrying a pipe map sketched on notebook paper. "There's no plumbing in this wall, not current plumbing anyway." Sabine tapped the screen. "It's stronger here." He leaned in. "That's impossible." "It is becoming a habit for you to say that." He did not smile, because your impossible village keeps producing neat little impossible graphs. Sabine used the resonance hammer gently along the wall, listening not with her ears but with the sensor response. Most sections returned dead, ordinary values. Then, near the upper beamline, one zone gave back a subtly different profile, denser, stiffer, almost as if the cavity behind the plaster had once been altered and sealed. "Thermal retrofitting," Jonas said. "Possibly, but only this patch." She crouched and ran her fingertips over the painted surface. The wall was cool, smooth, and gave away nothing. Yet the signal persisted there more strongly than anywhere else in the room. Sabine stepped back. "We need imaging. Later. For now, I want positional data across the village." On the way downstairs, Lucas stopped her at the landing. "You believe me," he said. It was not a question. Sabine studied him for a moment. "I believe the wall is doing something measurable." He nodded as though that were enough. Then his face tightened. "My grandfather says the forest is waking up." Does he believe that? He says his father heard a sound like this once when he was a child, after the war, but no one talked about it for long. Sabine felt a small shift inside her attention, like a lock turning. "After the war?" Lucas shrugged, suddenly uncertain. "That's what he says." Outside, the sky darkened again. Weather moved fast in the valley. By late afternoon, Sabine and Jonas had built the first rough map of surface anomalies. The strongest vibration clusters were not random. They curved through Haldenkirch in an arc that followed the slope of the village and then bent toward the forested basin northeast of the square. That was where the old quarry roads vanished beneath dense stands of fir. That was also where the granite outcrops ran closest to the surface. Sabine spread the preliminary map across the hood of the van while drizzle began to stipple the paper. "It's focusing," Jonas said. "Yes. From where?" She traced the lines with one finger. "Not from the sawmill, not from the ridge road. The geometry is wrong." "Then what are we looking at?" Sabine watched the arcs converge beyond the last row of houses. "A basin, or a reflector. Something is shaping the wave field." Jonas followed her gaze into the trees. Natural? She thought of the mathematically perfect water pattern in the fountain, of the hidden signal in Lucas's wall, of the way the village seemed to absorb fear and return it refined. "I don't know," she said. That answer stayed with her into evening. Mayor Rieber asked for an update in his office above the municipal records room. He listened without interrupting while rain ticked against the windows and the old radiator hissed. When Sabine explained that the phenomenon was real in physical terms but still not captured conventionally in air recordings, He looked both relieved and more frightened than before. "So it exists," he said. "Yes. And it is not the sawmill? Not based on what I have so far." He exhaled once, deeply. "That will not make matters easier." "Why?" He turned in his chair and opened a filing cabinet. For a while he searched without speaking. Then he removed a thin municipal folder, the paper browned at the edges, and placed it on the desk between them. "It may be nothing," he said. "I did not mention it because I did not want to encourage folklore." Inside the folder was a maintenance report from 1981. Road subsidence, water main inspection, temporary closure of the northeast forestry track after a ground vibration complaint from 3 households. Sabine looked up. "The complaint went nowhere," Robert said. "No source found. The file ends there." She turned the page. Tucked behind the report was a handwritten note on municipal letterhead, unsigned, likely never formally submitted. The ink had faded, but the sentence was still legible. "It is strongest in the old quarry basin, and only those old enough to remember the sirens seem to hear it." Sabine read it twice, then a third time. When she looked up, Mayor Raber was watching her with the expression of a man who had hoped history would remain dead if left undisturbed. Outside, somewhere beyond the rain-dark roofs of Haldenkirch, the forest was waiting. Rain settled over Haldenkirch that night in long, patient sheets, blurring the village into a watercolor of amber windows and dark timber lines. The forest beyond became almost invisible, only a deeper absence beyond the last houses. In the guesthouse room, Sabine spread the old municipal papers across the desk beneath the weak yellow lamp and read them again, slowly, as if repetition might force hidden meaning to rise from the page. The maintenance report from 1981 was bureaucratic in tone, almost aggressively dull. Minor ground vibration, resident concern, temporary inspection, no confirmed hazard, road access restored. It was precisely the kind of document designed to close a matter without truly examining it. Yet the unsigned note folded behind it did not belong to that language at all. It belonged to someone who had stepped outside procedure and for one brief moment tried to leave a warning in human terms. Only those old enough to remember the sirens seemed to hear it. Sabine sat back and listened to the radiator ticking. Her tinnitus was faint tonight, a thread rather than a blade, which almost made it worse. It left too much room for uncertainty. Had she really felt the low pressure in her jaw at the fountain? Had there truly been that submerged pulse under the air? Or had her own damaged hearing already begun to imitate the village's fear? She hated questions that could not be settled by calibration. She picked up her phone and photographed the handwritten note. Then she sent a short message to Jonas in the next room. "Come downstairs. Bring the 1981 topographic scans." 10 minutes later, they sat at a corner table in the empty guesthouse dining room, papers spread between coffee cups gone cold. Jonas had brought a laptop, rolled maps, and the resigned expression of someone who knew sleep was no longer part of the schedule. Sabine showed him the note. He read it twice. Sirens? Civil defense, maybe. Air raid memory. The older generation would be children of people who lived through the war or who grew up during Cold War alert culture. Jonas looked at the rain-streaked window. "You think the sound is somehow interacting with age, memory, trauma?" "I think whoever wrote this was trying to describe a pattern they could not explain." He nodded toward the folder. "And the old quarry basin?" Sabine unrolled the topographic map of Haldenkirch and weighted the corners with cutlery. Under the lamp, the valley opened in lines and contour shading. The square, the church, the clustered houses, the forestry roads curling into the trees, the abandoned quarry northeast of the village like a scar that had partially healed. She overlaid the day's vibration readings. The arc of surface anomalies bent almost perfectly toward that basin. Jonas whistled softly. "That's too neat." "Yes. But why would a quarry focus anything?" Sabine traced the granite ridges with one finger. Not the quarry alone. The valley walls, the bedrock. The slope angle. If a low-frequency signal were entering this basin from below or from some concealed source, the surrounding granite could be acting as a reflector. Not exactly a dish, but close enough at certain wavelengths. It would explain why the pattern strengthens in particular structures and water surfaces while staying elusive in open air. Jonas leaned closer, and why the square gets it worse than the edge roads, and why residents experience it differently depending on where they sleep. He rubbed one hand over his face. That still does not explain the age filter. No, Sabine said, it does not. That answer followed them into the morning. At first light, Haldenkirch looked washed raw. Rainwater ran in thin silver tracks along the cobblestones. The fountain in the square was still trembling, not constantly, but often enough now that Sabine no longer had to wait in patience for the pattern to reveal itself. It came like breath. It came like intention. Mayor Reber had arranged access to the municipal archives in the records room below his office. The room smelled of damp cardboard, dust and old ink. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labelled by year and topic in a clerk's careful handwriting. A small dehumidifier hummed in the corner. Sabine spent the first hours of the morning there, sleeves rolled up, sorting through planning requests, forestry permits, civil defence correspondence, utility maintenance logs, and land use revisions that extended back to the late 1960s. What she found at first was not revelation, but omission. Records were present where records should exist, but certain threads ended too abruptly. A road survey mentioned restricted access beyond the Northeast Basin in 1978, yet no supporting memo remained. A utility map showed a service conduit terminating near the old quarry, though there was no listed facility at its endpoint. A noise complaint filed by 3 households in 1981 had been stamped received, but the inspection report referenced in the margin was missing. Documents rarely shouted their secrets. More often, they whispered through absence. Around 10 o'clock, an older woman in a brown wool coat appeared at the doorway and stood watching Sabine sort files. She was perhaps 70, thin as vinewood, with a face worn into narrow planes by time and weather. Her hair had been pinned back too tightly. She did not look frightened. She looked irritated by history itself. "Are you the engineer from Stuttgart?" she asked. Sabine straightened. "Yes." The woman stepped farther into the room. "Then you are looking in the wrong century." Mayor Reber, who had been cataloguing folders nearby, sighed very quietly. "Frau Albrecht, I have not come to recite legends, Matthias," she said without turning. "Leave that to the tourists." Her name was Ingrid Albrecht, retired school principal, widow, resident of Haldenkirch all her life. She sat opposite Sabine without being invited and placed her handbag on her lap like a shield. "My brother heard it in 1981, she said. "Only at night then. He was 38. He thought there was machinery under the house. My father called him weak. My mother said the war had made all men too quick to hear threats. After 3 months, it stopped. Or perhaps people stopped admitting it." Sabine glanced at Reber, who avoided her eyes. "You knew this?" she asked him. "I knew some people remembered an earlier episode," he said, "not the details." Ingrid gave a dry, contemptuous sound. "Because the details embarrassed them. A village likes manageable stories, sickness, stress, bad blood. Nobody likes a thing without a face." Sabine turned back to her. "Did anyone investigate properly in 1981? A man came from Freiburg with equipment, not as much as yours. He walked the basin, took notes, argued with the forestry office and left." "What was his name?" Ingrid thought for a moment. "Lehmann, or Lennart. No, Dieter Lehmann, that was it." Sabine wrote it down. "What happened to him?" Ingrid's mouth tightened. "He returned once, maybe a week later, then no more. The mayor at the time said he found nothing, but my brother saw him in the inn 2 nights before he disappeared from the story, drunker than a careful man should have been, telling someone that the ground out there rang like a glass." "Disappeared from the story?" Sabine asked. "He stopped searching," Ingrid said. "That is what I said. In villages like this, people can vanish without dying. They simply learn what cannot be spoken usefully." The room fell silent, except for the dehumidifier. Sabine studied the older woman's face. There was no performance in it, only memory sharpened by grievance. "Do you hear the hum now?" Sabine asked. Ingrid's expression changed, not with fear but fatigue. "Yes. Mostly before dawn. It feels lower than before. More certain." "And your brother?" "He is dead." "I'm sorry." "He hanged himself in 1996, Ingrid said, with the same hard clarity she had used for everything else. Not because of this. Life is not that simple, but I sometimes wonder whether people can remain untouched by what they once spend months trying not to hear. After she left, Mayor Rebert closed the archive door and stood with his hands in his coat pockets. "You think she is reliable?" he asked. Sabine considered the question. Reliable enough to matter. He nodded toward the file stacks. "And what does it matter toward?" She did not answer, not because she wished to be evasive, but because the pattern was still forming. What Ingrid had provided was not proof. It was something almost as important, continuity. The mystery in Haldenkirch was not an isolated event. It had happened before, or something close enough to it had happened before, and someone had once come looking for a cause and then stopped. By early afternoon, Sabine and Jonas drove the narrow forestry road toward the northeast basin. Mist clung low between the trunks. The farther they moved from the village, the more the forest seemed to absorb scale. Trees stood in regimented dark columns. Wet needles softened their footsteps when they left the road and walked the final stretch on foot. The quarry had long since been reclaimed by moss and scrub pine, but its geometry remained visible. A shallow artificial bowl cut into the slope, its edges softened by decades of weather. Jonas set a portable geophone in the ground. Sabine took laser readings against exposed granite faces. The air was still. No trucks, no chainsaws, no visible activity of any kind. Yet the instruments responded almost immediately. The ground here was carrying the same repeating, low-frequency excitation as the village, only stronger. Jonas stared at the screen. "So this is it, at least part of it." "Part," Sabine said. He swept the basin with a handheld microphone, though they both knew by now how little the air was willing to confess. Could there be an underground cavity? Some kind of old bunker? Possibly. Old quarry infrastructure, storage gallery, service tunnel, or something newer hidden inside something older. Sabine looked toward the tree line. Yes. There were signs once you knew to look. Not obvious signs, not a gate or a fence or a fresh concrete seam in the earth, but anomalies. A drainage channel too straight to be natural, an embankment under the moss that held a suspicious regularity, a line of older fir trees interrupted by a younger strip, as if the ground beneath that section had once been opened and then resealed. Jonas followed her gaze. "You see it too." She was about to answer when voices came through the trees, men, more than one, not close but approaching along the upper track. Sabine and Jonas exchanged a look. Seconds later, 3 men emerged from the mist in forestry jackets, boots dark with mud, their expressions already set in the rigid politeness of confrontation. The one in front was thick-necked, in his late 40s, with the confident hostility of someone used to being obeyed in local matters. Sabine recognized him vaguely from the square. He had watched them unloading equipment with crossed arms and did not seem pleased that observation had continued into the forest. "You are off the permitted road," he said. Sabine kept her voice even. "We're conducting environmental measurements at the request of the mayor. This land is managed by the Holzgemeinschaft. The municipality gave us access." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Municipality gives many things it does not own. Jonas straightened beside the equipment case. "We're not damaging anything." The man ignored him and kept his attention on Sabine. "People here are already nervous. Your van, your wires, your devices in the square, it makes trouble. Then the papers start writing about poison or contamination or secret factories, and suddenly contracts disappear. Families eat rumors for supper. You understand?" Sabine said nothing. He nodded toward the geophone spike in the soil. "So whatever game Stuttgart is playing, I suggest you play it carefully." When the men finally walked on, the silence they left behind felt denser than before. Jonas let out a breath. That was subtle. Sabine crouched beside the instrument again, though her attention had shifted. The mystery was no longer merely physical. It had history. It had local resistance. And somewhere in the gap between them stood a man from 1981 named Dieter Lehmann, who had once noticed the same thing and then, for reasons no one could properly explain, stopped. As she packed the sensors, her boot struck something buried just beneath the moss near the basin's edge. It gave a dull, synthetic sound that did not belong to stone or root. Sabine knelt, pulled back the wet moss with gloved fingers, and uncovered a thin black strip embedded in the soil. Not rubber, not cable, foam. Dense, decayed, artificial foam. She touched it once, and even through the glove she could feel a faint, impossible vibration moving through it like a pulse. The foam came out of the earth in brittle black fragments, as if the ground had been trying for years to digest something it had never wanted. Sabine knelt at the edge of the old quarry basin while drizzle fell through the fir branches in a fine grey mist. With a folding probe from her field kit, she lifted another section free. The material was porous, dense, and layered with the damp grit of decades. Age had stiffened it. Root fibers had pushed through it. Yet beneath the decay, there remained a structure too regular to be accidental. Jonas crouched beside her, lowering the beam of his flashlight. That isn't insulation from a cottage wall. No. She placed the fragment in a specimen bag. Another piece lay deeper under the moss, then another, forming what looked less like scattered debris than the edge of a buried sheet. The quarry floor around them remained silent in the ordinary sense. No engines, no wind gusts strong enough to animate the branches. But the geophone still displayed the same disciplined low-frequency excitation, stronger here than in the village, and every time Sabine's glove brushed the exposed foam, she felt that faint interior pressure in her fingertips. Jonas glanced uphill toward the forestry track where the three men had disappeared. "You think they know this is here?" Sabine did not answer immediately. She was looking at the cut edge of the material. It had not torn naturally. At some point, someone had cut it in panels. "Maybe," she said at last. "Maybe not. Local power often guards consequences more fiercely than causes." He gave her a look. That sounded almost philosophical. "It's fatigue. It's worse when you get precise." She ignored him and took measurements. The exposed strip appeared to run in a line beneath the moss, parallel to the slight artificial embankment she had noticed earlier. That embankment, too regular to be entirely natural, now looked less like a landscape scar and more like an attempt to hide one. She marked coordinates, photographed the site, collected 3 samples, and then stood slowly, knees protesting. The old quarry basin had changed in her mind. Until that moment, it had been a suspicious geometry, a point of convergence for data. Now it was also a place that someone, at some time, had deliberately modified using specialized material. "What kind of foam?" Jonas asked. "Hard to say in the field. Acoustic dampening would be one possibility." "Industrial?" "Possibly." He looked back down at the bag in her hand. "You're saying somebody lined part of the ground with acoustic foam, out here, in the middle of the forest. I'm saying it doesn't belong to a quarry abandoned on municipal maps." They packed in silence. The forest around them held the kind of quiet that never felt empty in the Black Forest. Water dripped from branch to branch. Somewhere high above, a raven gave one blunt call and then nothing. As they hiked back toward the road, Sabine's thoughts moved in widening circles. If the foam was what she suspected, it raised more than one problem. First, acoustic dampening material buried in a rural quarry was itself abnormal. Second, good dampening was usually used to contain something. Third, anyone trying to contain low-frequency vibration understood that ordinary walls and doors were often useless against it, which meant someone had expected a sound problem serious enough to require engineering beyond the visible surface. By the time they returned to Haldenkirch, the sky had lowered again, and the village looked pressed flatter by weather. A delivery truck idled outside the bakery. 2 older men stood in the square, speaking too intensely, their faces close and bloodless. When Sabine crossed past the fountain, one of them broke off mid-sentence and stared at the specimen bag in her hand, as though it might contain evidence against his own life. Mayor Reber met them in the municipal office just before dusk. Sabine laid the photographs and bagged samples on his desk without ceremony. He leaned over them, blinking behind his glasses. "Is that from the basin?" "Yes." "It could be anything." "It could," Sabine said, "but not naturally occurring anything." Jonas set a laptop beside the samples and opened the day's field map. The vibration intensities curved through Haldenkirch and concentrated toward the quarry in a pattern that had become increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Reber listened while Sabine explained the measurements, the positional gradient, the structural coupling, and the new concern that there might be something below or adjacent to the basin altering the wave field. When she mentioned buried acoustic dampening, he sat down very slowly. "I need old land records," she said. "Ownership, easements, utility corridors, civil defense usage, military leases. Anything tied to that sector from the 1960s onward." Rebbe rubbed a hand over his face. "If there was military use, it may not be in municipal files. Then whatever is missing may matter as much as what remains." For a long moment, he looked at the foam as though it had offended him personally. Then he unlocked a cabinet behind his desk and removed a flat tin box, its paint chipped away at the corners. "This was not in the archive," he said. "It was in my predecessor's private things when the office was cleared after his death. I never catalogued it because it seemed irrelevant. Old personal papers." He opened the box. Inside lay receipts, yellowing notes, a brass church key, and a narrow notebook bound in dark blue cloth. No label, no municipal stamp. The pages inside were covered in compact handwriting, the ink faded but legible. "Whose is it?" Sabine asked. "I believe it belonged to Emil Hartung, deputy mayor in the late 70s. He handled infrastructure and forestry liaison. Some people said he knew more about the valley than the maps did." Sabine took the notebook and opened to the middle at random. At first, the entries were routine. Road surfaces, drainage concerns, supply deliveries after winter storms. Then the tone shifted. Dates became irregular, observations shorter, sharper, phrases underlined twice. People complaining of vibration again near Northeast Basin. No result from district men. Forestry office insists all equipment off at night. Water in square fountain patterned this morning. Marta noticed first. Sabine turned another page. Meeting requested with Stuttgart delegation postponed. No written confirmation. Told not to discuss legacy installation until ministry review. She stopped. Jonas, standing behind her shoulder, read the line aloud under his breath. "Legacy installation." Reba's chair scraped slightly against the floor. "What ministry?" "There's no header," Sabine said. She continued reading. One page later, the handwriting became visibly less steady. "Heard it myself at 0310. Not through ear, through chest and teeth. Like standing near distant artillery, but without impact. Ingrid's brother not wrong." Another page, then another. Foam delivered under agricultural invoice. Wrong labeling. Asked no questions in front of K. Work continued below after track closure. Sabine looked up. "Who is K?" Reba shook his head slowly. "Could be anyone. Karl, Konrad, Klaus." "Or a surname initial," Jonas said. The final written page held only one full sentence, hurried enough to cut through the paper. "If Lehman returns, tell him not to go alone." The rest of the notebook was blank. No one spoke for several seconds. Rain whispered against the windows. Somewhere below, a door opened and shut in the corridor. The silence in the office had changed shape. Until now, Haldenkirch's mystery had still allowed for the possibility of a strange but impersonal explanation. Geology, industrial error, environmental resonance. The notebook narrowed that safety. It suggested prior knowledge, coordination, concealment. It suggested that in the late 1970s or early 1980s, something beneath or near the Northeast Basin had been important enough to hide, dampen, mislabel, and protect through silence. "What is a legacy installation?" Rebert asked quietly. Sabine closed the notebook. "A phrase people use when they don't want to write what a thing really is." Jonas exhaled through his nose. "Military, or civil defense, or industrial research under another name." Under the forest, she looked toward the darkening window. There are older layers in this country than people remember comfortably." Reba stood and began pacing the narrow office, which seemed suddenly too small for him. "If this becomes public before we know more, the village will split apart. Half will demand evacuation. The other half will say I am inventing state conspiracies to close the timber operations." Sabine understood the fear. Haldenkirch did not merely depend on employment. It depended on the story it told itself about continuity, honesty, and ordinary hardship. To suggest that something engineered and hidden might have been pulsing beneath the forest for decades was to imply that the village had not simply suffered misfortune. It had been used. That night, Sabine and Jonas converted the guest house dining room into a temporary document lab, After Frau Brenner grudgingly agreed on the condition that nothing chemical be spilled on her tables, Jonas scanned the notebook. Sabine photographed each page, enhanced faded lines and cross-referenced dates with the municipal folder and topographic maps. Between them, they built the beginnings of a timeline, complaints around 1981, a man from Freiburg named Dieter Lehmann investigating, mentions of a Stuttgart delegation, a legacy installation, foam delivered under false labeling, work continuing below after road closure. Below, the word did not appear explicitly, but it formed everywhere in the gaps. At 10:30, Jonas pushed back from the laptop and pinched the bridge of his nose. Sample catalogue from the foam is going to take until morning, but if it's what you think... Sabine looked up from the scanned notebook pages. Say it. He hesitated. If it's specialized acoustic dampening from that era, we may be looking at something government adjacent. Military procurement, certain cold storage installations, test chambers, secure communication sites, even bunkers. Not a theory yet. No, but not harmless either. She nodded. The guest house was quiet around them. Too quiet. Above, floorboards creaked once, then stilled. In the kitchen, a refrigerator cycled on and off with a sound that made Sabine flinch before she realized what it was. Fatigue was beginning to fray her responses. She hated that too. Just before 11, there was a knock at the glass door. Frau Brenner opened it before Sabine could rise. A man stood outside in the wet dark, hatless, breathing too hard. It was the village pharmacist, the same one Petra Kessler had accused in the square days earlier. His coat was buttoned wrong. One lens of his glasses was cracked. He says he needs the engineer, Frau Brenner said, already irritated by his panic. Sabine crossed the room. What happened? The pharmacist stared at her with eyes that looked stretched thin by sleeplessness. It's Petra, he said. She's gone. Gone where? She left her house 20 minutes ago. Her husband thought she went to the cellar. Then he found the back door open. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow made the words more disturbing. She kept saying the sound wasn't in the village anymore. He swallowed. She said it was calling from the forest. By the time Sabine reached Petra Kessler's house, the rain had thinned to a cold mist, fine enough to settle on coats and hair without ever seeming to fall. The village street behind the church was already filling with people in boots and dark jackets, drawn not only by concern, but by the dangerous magnetism of a crisis that seemed to justify everything they had been feeling. Porch lights burned amber through damp glass. A dog barked without pause somewhere uphill. No one was speaking at normal volume. Petra's husband stood under the eaves with both hands on the back of his neck, as though holding his own head in place. He was a broad man in his early 50s, Joseph Kessler, a forklift operator at the timber cooperative, and he had the dazed, humiliated look of someone whose private domestic disaster had been forced into public view. She was in the kitchen, he said for the third time, his voice cracked from repeating it. She kept listening toward the back garden. I told her to sit down. I went to get her tablets. When I came back, the door was open. What exactly did she say? Sabine asked. Joseph stared past her toward the dark line of the forest. That it had moved. That it wasn't under the square anymore. That it wanted her to come closer so she could hear the real words. A murmur moved through the people gathered behind them. Sabine could feel the village trying to transform a frightened woman into a symbol, a warning, perhaps even a prophet. That was how panic organized itself when facts were missing. Mayor Rieber arrived seconds later, coat half-buttoned, breathing hard from the uphill walk. A local police officer came with him, young enough to look wrong in the scene, his face caught between professional procedure and private disbelief. He began taking names, asking when Petra had last been seen, whether she had relatives nearby, whether she had a history of wandering, agitation, psychiatric treatment. The questions were correct. They were also already insufficient. She went toward the northeast track. An older woman called from the garden gate. I saw someone in a red scarf crossing behind the sheds. Petra's husband nodded violently. She was wearing the red scarf. Sabine turned to Rieber. How many people can you gather who are still coherent enough to search safely? He looked offended by the word coherent, then realized it was exactly the issue. Around them, several villages were visibly unsteady. One man was grinding his jaw so hard the muscles stood out in his temples. Another kept glancing over his shoulder at nothing. Too many will make it worse, Sabine said quietly. This is dark, wet terrain, and they are already suggestible. The police officer bristled a little. Suggestible? Tired, frightened, overstimulated, and under the influence of a repeating low-frequency disturbance, we do not yet understand, she said. Pick your preferred term. The officer looked away first. In the end, the search party was kept small. Sabine, Jonas, Reber, the young policeman whose name was Felix Maurer, Petra's husband, despite Sabine's objection, and 2 volunteer firefighters who still appeared steady enough on their feet to be useful. The others were told to remain in the village and report any sightings. No one liked the instruction. Many ignored the spirit of it by trailing at a distance anyway. The forest received them like a closed mouth. Their flashlights cut pale tunnels through mist and trunks. Wet pine needles softened footsteps, while hidden roots and stones caught at boots in the dark. The northeast track climbed gently and then bent toward the old basin, its edges crowded by black fir and tangled undergrowth. Sabine walked near the front, one hand on the strap of her field bag, the other holding a handheld vibration meter that she had grabbed on instinct before leaving the guest house. It now seemed less like a tool and more like a nervous habit. Every few minutes she checked it. Every few minutes the readings remained wrong. Not random, wrong. The low-frequency excitation that had been concentrated around the basin during the day was now fluctuating in pulses, rising and falling as though some buried mechanism were shifting states beneath the ground. Jonas saw her looking at the display. Higher, he whispered. Yes. By how much? Enough. That answer made him go quiet. Halfway to the basin, Joseph Kessler stopped abruptly and gripped a tree trunk with both hands. Do you hear that? He asked. No one answered immediately. Sabine listened. Wind moved through branches. Water dripped somewhere in the dark. Her own blood seemed loud in her ears. Then, for a fraction of a second, something pressed through all of it, so low and interior that she could not have sworn whether she had heard it or only received it. A broad, submerged vibration that seemed to swell inside her chest rather than arrive from any direction outside it. Joseph made a strangled sound. There, it's saying something. Felix, the young officer, reached for his arm. Herr Kessler. It is not words, Sabine snapped, more sharply than intended. Keep moving. She did not say the rest aloud, because if people began hearing language inside the hum, they were already halfway to surrendering their judgment to it. The searchlights found Petra 20 minutes later at the edge of the old quarry basin. She was kneeling in the wet moss with both hands pressed flat against the ground, her red scarf darkened by rain. At first, Sabine thought she was praying. Then Petra lifted her head, and the expression on her face was not devotion. It was concentration so intense it had become almost childlike. Petra, her husband called. She flinched violently, not at his voice, but as if some other sound had been interrupted. No, she said, be quiet. Joseph took a step toward her. Come home. They stop when you talk. Her eyes moved over the group without seeming to settle on any one face. It was almost clear this time. Sabine approached more slowly than the others. What was clear? Petra looked at her at last. Her pupils were too large in the flashlight beam. What happened under here? She whispered. They nearly had it. The firefighters exchanged a glance. Felix shifted his weight. Behind them, something moved among the trees. Perhaps only one of the villagers who had followed at a distance. Perhaps not. The basin suddenly felt too open and too enclosed at the same time. Sabine crouched a few steps away from Petra. Did someone tell you that? No. Did you see something? Petra shook her head impatiently, like a woman annoyed by a foolish child. Not see, remember, but it is not my memory. Joseph made a soft, broken sound. Please. Petra looked at him without recognition. For one terrible instant, Sabine saw what sleep loss, fear, and prolonged physiological stress could do when given a shape to obey. It was not madness in the theatrical sense. It was intrusion. It was the mind losing ownership of its own emphasis. Sabine moved closer. Petra, listen to me. Put your hands in your lap. Petra did not move. Now. At last, slowly, she lifted her palms from the earth. Mud coated them to the wrists. and beneath where her hands had been, the moss was vibrating, not the surrounding ground, not the puddles nearby. A narrow strip in the basin floor, no wider than a grave plank, trembling with fine, precise motion that should not have been visible in low light, and yet unmistakably was. Jonas swore under his breath. Felix shone his flashlight down and stepped back at once. "What the hell is that?" No one answered. The strip of ground quivered with a rhythm too controlled to be natural. Sabine knelt beside it and held the vibration meter low. The reading spiked so sharply that for a second she thought the device had failed. "It's strongest here," she said. "Then we should not be standing here," Jonas replied. He was right, but the warning came too late. From somewhere uphill, a shout broke through the trees, then another. Lights were moving fast toward the basin. Too many lights, too erratic to belong to the small authorized search party. The villagers who had followed at a distance had not remained at a distance after all. They came down through the wet dark in a ragged cluster, calling Petra's name, calling Yosef's, calling questions into the trees as though volume could restore reason. Several were older men from the square. One woman was crying. Another was laughing in short, frightened bursts that sounded almost mechanical. "Stay back," Mayor Reba shouted. No one listened. The moment the first of them stepped into the basin, the atmosphere changed. Sabine never found a better word for what happened next. Later, in notes she never published, she wrote only that the sound field appeared to crest. But in the body, it felt less technical than that. It felt as if the air had thickened and the ground had briefly become a diaphragm, pushing one enormous sub-audible pulse through everything at once. Sabine felt it in her sternum, in her teeth, in the fluid behind her eyes. Felix dropped to one knee. One of the firefighters vomited into the moss, and the villagers began shouting over one another, not because anything visible had attacked them, because each seemed suddenly certain that the others were hiding something. Accusations came without sequence or sense. "You knew. You left it running. Tell them about the trucks. You hear it too, don't lie." Yosef grabbed one of the older men by the coat. The man swung wildly in return. Petra laughed once, a sound so wrong in the dark that Sabine felt cold move through her limbs. Reba tried to force himself between them. Felix was shouting for calm, but his words broke apart as soon as they left his mouth. This was no longer a search. It was a pressure vessel rupturing. Sabine seized Jonas by the sleeve. "Get Petra away from the ground, now!" He moved at once, half lifting, half dragging the stunned woman toward the track. Sabine turned to help Reba separate the men grappling near the basin edge. But before she reached them, someone came out of the dark from her left and struck her shoulder hard enough to spin her sideways. For a moment she thought it was an accident, a flailing panic blow. Then she saw the face, one of the forestry men from the afternoon, the thick-necked one. Rain shone on his jaw and cheeks. His eyes were not wild exactly. They were worse, focused, purposeful, and full of a furious conviction that frightened her more than hysteria would have. "You need to stop digging," he said. Then he shoved her again. Sabine lost her footing on the wet moss and went down hard on one knee. Pain shot up her leg. By the time she looked up, the man had already moved into the chaos, disappearing between bodies and flashlight beams. Felix saw only the aftermath. "Did he hit you?" Sabine got back to her feet. "Forget me, break this up." But the basin had tipped beyond orderly control. The older villagers were no longer responding to instruction. Some were shouting at the ground, some at each other. One woman had sunk to her knees with both hands clamped over her ears, though Sabine suspected ears had little to do with what any of them were now experiencing. In the confusion, Petra tore free from Jonas and ran. Not back toward the village, into the trees beyond the basin. Joseph shouted her name and plunged after her. Reba followed. Felix cursed and ran too. The firefighters hesitated, torn between the fight still breaking apart at the basin and the fleeing figures vanishing into the forest. Sabine followed the red flash of Petra's scarf through the dark trunks, branches striking her coat and face. Her shoulder throbbed where the forestry man had hit her. Her lungs burned with cold air. Behind her, the basin noise, or whatever human noise had fused with it, faded and returned in broken swells. Then the forest changed. The ground sloped unexpectedly, steeper than the map suggested. Under the fir needles was not the soft randomness of natural soil, but something more structured. Straight stone edges hidden under moss, a drainage lip, a half-buried retaining wall. Sabine nearly tripped over a rusted metal post protruding from the earth at an angle. Ahead, Petra had stopped. She stood at the foot of a fern-covered rise, staring into a wall of rock and roots. At first, Sabine saw nothing unusual there. Then Jonas's flashlight beam, arriving from behind and to the side, caught a line that should not have existed in forest stone. A seam. Tall, vertical, almost invisible beneath decades of moss and soil, but unmistakably straight. Petra raised one muddy hand and touched the seam with the reverence of someone greeting a door she had known all her life, without ever seeing. "It's here," she said softly. Sabine stepped closer, heart pounding hard enough to drown even her own uncertainty. The rock face was not a rock face. It was a concealed entrance. And from the thin black gap, where stone should have been seamless, a current of cold air was breathing out of the mountain. The cold air spilling from the seam did not smell like forest. It carried no wet leaf rot, no pine resin, no mineral freshness from a natural cave. What emerged from the hidden gap in the hillside was older, drier, and unmistakably mechanical, beneath the damp, metal dust, stale insulation, the faint sourness of long-sealed concrete. Sabine stood a step away from the disguised entrance and felt the temperature shift against her face like breath from an underground lung. Behind her, the forest was still alive with confusion. Voices rose and fell through the mist from the basin below. Someone shouted Petra's name again. Another shouted for the police. But here, at the seam in the hill, all of that suddenly felt secondary, almost superficial, as though the village's panic had only been a surface symptom of something larger and more patient beneath it. Petra Kessler laid both hands against the moss-dark vertical line and closed her eyes. "This is where it wants to be heard," she murmured. Her voice had lost the wild urgency from the basin. Now it carried a terrible calm, the calm of someone who believed she had at last reached the source of her own torment. Joseph took a stumbling step toward her. "Petra, move away from that." She did not obey. Felix Maurer arrived seconds later, out of breath, flashlight trembling in his hand. Mayer Reber came after him, slower and red-faced from the climb, one hand pressed against his side. Jonas reached Sabine's shoulder and stopped the moment he saw the seam in the rock. "What is that?" Felix asked. Sabine did not look away from the disguised entrance. Not natural. Jonas swept his light up and down the slope. The camouflage had been expertly done for its time and then left to age into invisibility. Moss, root systems, and weather had concealed the shape almost completely, but once recognized, the artificial structure could no longer be unseen. Poured concrete margins disguised by rock veneer, a corroded hinge channel buried in soil, a recessed threshold choked with fern and debris. "It's a door," Jonas said. Reber stared at it in mute disbelief. "There is no facility on any map." "Then it was built not to be mapped," Sabine said. At that, Petra turned her head slightly and smiled in a way that chilled everyone present. "They mapped it," she whispered, "just not for us." Joseph reached for her arm. She yanked it away with surprising strength. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "You make it louder." Felix moved between them with the cautious force of a man trying to keep order in a reality that had already abandoned his training. "We are not opening anything tonight," he said. "We get more personnel. We secure the area. We take Petra back to the village." Reasonable words. Correct words. But even as he spoke them, Sabine saw the flaw. The hum, or whatever mechanism stood behind the hum, was escalating. The readings at the basin had spiked. Petra had been drawn here as if following a buried line through the forest. And now cold air was issuing from a concealed entrance, hidden in an abandoned quarry sector, linked to old foam dampening, falsified invoices, and a forgotten investigation. Waiting until morning might have been prudent. It might also have been disastrous. Sabine stepped closer to the seam and shone her own flashlight along the lower edge. The beam caught something metallic beneath the dirt, a recessed panel, partly exposed where years of runoff had washed the slope clean. "Jonas," she said, "help me clear this." Felix stared at her. "Absolutely not. We need to know whether this is active. We need a warrant, backup, and whatever branch of the government deals with hidden bunkers in forests. Sabine turned to him. "And if something down there is intensifying the vibration tonight?" Felix opened his mouth, then closed it, because he had been in the basin too. He had felt the pulse in his body, the way thought became brittle under it. Procedure still existed, but procedure had already arrived late. While Felix hesitated, Jonas used a folding entrenching tool from the equipment bag to scrape moss and wet soil from the threshold. The dull clang of metal against metal emerged almost immediately. Beneath the dirt was a narrow steel service box set into the concrete flank of the doorway. Its cover had corroded almost shut. Reba looked around the dark forest as if expecting someone to appear and forbid them all from taking another breath. "If this is federal property..." "It was federal property once, maybe," Sabine said. "If it has been abandoned long enough to vanish from municipal memory, it belongs now to whatever consequences it still produces." The line silenced even her. She had not meant to sound so certain. In truth, uncertainty had begun wearing her down from the inside. Her tinnitus was louder tonight, not screaming, but threading itself around the edges of perception in a way that made every faint vibration suspect. More than once on the climb, she had wondered whether the pulse in her jaw came from the hidden mechanism in the hill or from her own damaged auditory system improvising terror. But the instruments had confirmed enough. The fountain, Lucas's wall, the basin floor, the foam, doubt remained, but not in the village's suffering. Jonas pried the service box open with the butt of the entrenching tool. Inside was a row of dead switches, a rusted emergency crank socket, and a key cylinder sealed behind grime. "No power indicators," he said. "Could still be mechanically operable," Sabine replied. Felix took 2 steps forward. "Engineer Keller, if you proceed, I need to make it clear I have not authorized..." The ground shuddered. It lasted less than a second, yet it passed through all of them with unmistakable force. Not an earthquake, not a landslip. A concentrated low-frequency impact from somewhere below, broad enough to unsettle the stomach, and brief enough to leave silence even more frightening afterward. Petra gave a soft gasp of pleasure. Joseph began to cry, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the involuntary breaking sounds of a man whose understanding had finally failed him. Jonas stepped back from the panel. That came from inside. Sabine already knew. She knelt by the service box and wiped grime from the engraved metal plate beneath the crank socket. The lettering had corroded but not disappeared. Anlage B12, not Betrieb Zugang, West Facility B12, Emergency Operation, West Access. Felix read it over her shoulder. "What does that mean?" "It means this is one entrance of more than one," Sabine said. "And Anlage," Reba asked, "a facility." The mayor looked suddenly unwell. There was no key. But there was an emergency crank system, precisely the kind installed where sealed access might need to be opened during power failure. Jonas rummaged through the equipment bag and produced an adjustable socket handle. It fit imperfectly, but enough. He looked at Sabine. "Tell me to stop." She did not. Together they forced the mechanism through its first resistant quarter turn. Metal groaned somewhere deep inside the wall. Wet soil loosened from the seam. Petra began whispering again, too quietly for anyone to catch the words. A second turn, harder, then a third. Something released with a long internal clunk, as if locks untouched for decades had decided at last to remember their function. The disguised door shifted inward by less than a centimeter. Cold air rushed out more strongly. It smelled now not only of dust and old concrete, but of oil. Everyone stepped back except Sabine. She wedged her gloved fingers into the narrow opening and pulled. The door resisted, then opened with a sound like deep stone grinding its teeth. Jonas joined her. Together they created a gap wide enough for flashlight beams to enter. The light fell into a descending passage lined with concrete ribs and cable channels. Water dripped from the ceiling. Rust streaked the walls in dark vertical veins. The passage sloped down steeply enough to disappear into blackness after 10 meters. On one wall hung a metal sign tilted at an angle, its lettering almost eaten through. "Betreten nur mit Genehmigung." Entry only with authorization. Felix swore softly. Reba took off his glasses, wiped them, then put them back on as if clearer lenses might restore the world to something governable. "This cannot be under my village." Sabine stood at the threshold, flashlight beam steady, pulse not steady at all. The hum was stronger here. Not heard exactly, received. It moved through the passage in broad invisible pressure bands that seemed to expand against the body and then recede. In the confined air of the corridor, there was no more pretending that the phenomenon belonged to rumor. This was engineered space responding to engineered failure. "Jonas," she said quietly, "air sample. Temperature gradient, surface radiation, just in case." He nodded at once and began unpacking instruments with efficient hands that nevertheless betrayed their tension. The dosimeter showed nothing unusual. The air sample registered stale but breathable atmosphere with elevated particulates. The temperature inside the passage was significantly lower than the forest outside. Felix radioed for backup. Static swallowed half his words when he finally got through to dispatch. The response was confused, delayed, and contaminated by the same disbelief that had dogged the entire case from the beginning. Hidden door, unmapped facility. Potential hazard. He sounded even to himself like a man inventing a bad thriller while standing in wet boots in the middle of nowhere. Petra would not leave, even when Joseph begged, even when Mayor Reber ordered, even when Felix threatened formal detention. She simply stood near the entrance with her head tilted, as though listening to distant music in a concert hall no one else had paid to enter. "It is clearer now," she said. Sabine turned sharply. "What is?" "The pattern, the rise and fall. It almost makes sense." "What sense?" Petra blinked slowly, as if translating from another language. "Not words, instructions." A dangerous answer. Perhaps meaningless, perhaps merely the brain's desperate attempt to impose order on physiological stress. But Sabine could not dismiss it entirely. Not after the notebook, not after the falsified invoices, not after the line about work continuing below. Jonas finished the initial readings and looked up from the analyzer. No obvious toxic gas. Air is bad, but not instantly bad. "Then we go in 10 meters, Sabine said. "No farther tonight." Felix stared at her as though she had lost her mind. "No, absolutely not. We need visual confirmation of what kind of site this is. We need a specialist team." "We have a specialist team," Jonas muttered. "You are an acoustic engineer and a man with a shovel." Jonas almost smiled, but not quite. In the end, Felix did not consent so much as fail to stop them. He insisted on going first with his flashlight and service pistol drawn, which Sabine privately considered useless against concrete, rust, and old machinery. Jonas followed. Sabina went third, carrying the vibration meter and a compact camera. Reba refused to enter, remaining at the threshold with Petra and Joseph. That left Felix's radio crackling in the damp corridor while the three of them descended into the breath of the hill. Every step down sharpened the pressure in Sabine's body. Her teeth ached. The old tinnitus thread in her ears seemed to recoil and then mingle with the deeper pulse around them until she no longer trusted the borders between internal and external noise. The corridor walls were lined at intervals with metal brackets, empty now, perhaps once holding cables or conduit. Old painted numbers marked sections in fading white. W3, W4. At 8 meters, Jonas stopped and played his light across the floor. There were tracks in the dust, not recent boot prints, something narrower, repeating wheel marks, decades old and half obscured. A trolley line, equipment cart. The passage had once moved more than people. Then Felix's beam landed on the wall ahead, and all three of them stopped. Bolted to the concrete was a steel plaque, green with age but still legible. Bundesamt für Zivil. Sicherung akustischer Belastungsreihe. Versuchskomplex B12, 1978. Federal Office for Civil Security. Acoustic Stress Series. Test Complex B12, 1978. Jonas let out a breath that sounded very small in the corridor. Sabine felt the world contract around the text. Not folklore, not geology alone, not a village sickness inventing its own monster. An acoustic stress complex. A test installation. And if the plaque was truthful, the facility beneath Haldenkirk had been built for the deliberate study of what prolonged sound, or pressure, or resonance, could do to human beings. Felix turned toward her slowly. What exactly were they testing? Sabine opened her mouth. Before she could answer, every flashlight in the corridor flickered once. Then, from somewhere deep below them in the buried dark, a siren began to rise. The siren did not sound like an alarm meant for rescue. It began low, almost beneath hearing, as though the buried complex were clearing its throat after decades of silence. Then it climbed in a long, mechanical swell through the concrete corridor, turning the air itself into something abrasive. The sound was old-fashioned in the worst possible way. Not digital, not clean, but generated by machinery built in an era that still trusted metal to intimidate the human body directly. Felix flinched first, one shoulder striking the wall. Jonas swore and clapped a hand over one ear, even though ear covering was instinctively useless against what was moving through the corridor. Sabine felt the note rise through her jaw and sternum, through the fluid behind her eyes, until for a sickening second she could not tell whether she was standing upright or being tilted inside her own skull. "Back!" Felix shouted, though the word came out broken by the reverberation. "Back now!" They moved fast, slipping on damp concrete as the siren climbed and then abruptly cut off. The silence afterward was worse. Not true silence. Never true silence in Haldenkirch anymore, but the kind of blank mechanical absence that follows a system checking whether the people inside it still know fear. At the threshold, Reba seized Sabine's arm as she emerged into the cold forest air. What happened? She steadied herself against the concrete flank of the entrance. The facility is real. Petra gave a small laugh that sounded almost tender. Of course it is. Felix came out behind her, pale and furious. No one goes farther tonight, no one. I'm sealing the area until District Command gets here. Jonas bent forward with both hands on his knees, breathing through his mouth. That siren was triggered by us. Or by presence detection, Sabine said. Felix looked at her sharply. Presence detection in a bunker abandoned for 50 years. Abandoned things fail. They do not always die. Below the ridge, the basin had gone quiet. The shouting had faded. Perhaps the pulse that had thrown the villagers into chaos had subsided. Perhaps exhaustion had simply swallowed its own aftermath. Either way, the forest now held an uneasy truce, as though everyone and everything were listening for the next instruction from underground. Sabine took the camera from around her neck and reviewed the image she had managed to capture before the siren began. The plaque was blurred but legible. Federal Office for Civil Security, Acoustic Stress Series, Test Complex B12, 1978. The apparent explanation was already forming in Felix's face, in Reber's, in Jonas's too. Cold War facility, experimental installation, old government mistake, failing machinery underground, strange hum as a byproduct. Terrible, yes. Concealed, yes, but at least comprehensible, at least manageable by the ordinary architecture of blame. A buried bunker generating a dangerous low-frequency signal. It was tidy enough to be comforting. Sabine distrusted it at once, because if B12 had simply been a sealed Cold War stress facility left to rot, several things still made no sense. The mathematically perfect vibration patterns in the fountain and in Lucas Voss's bedroom wall were too disciplined for mere accidental decay. The falsified agricultural invoices for acoustic foam suggested not abandonment, but active concealment even after local complaints began. And the old note in Hartung's notebook, "If Lehman returns, tell him not to go alone," implied that someone investigating the site in 1981 had not been facing only broken infrastructure. He had been facing risk. As backup remained distant and static-ridden over Felix's radio, Sabine made the decision she knew he would hate. "I want Petra taken back to the village and watched continuously," she said. Felix turned on her. "And I want you to stop making requests as if this is your operation. This is still an acoustic event. This is now a potentially illegal underground federal site, which is still producing an acoustic event." Felix stepped closer, rain shining on his cheeks and brow. He was young, earnest, and trying very hard not to be overwhelmed by the absurdity of the night. "Engineer Keller, listen to me carefully. We have a hidden bunker, unstable civilians, possible toxic exposure, and no secured perimeter. You will return to the village." Sabine met his stare. "And you will do what? Stand guard over a locked door while whatever is below continues to escalate? I will wait for people trained for this." She almost said the cruel thing, that the people trained for this had built it. Instead, she looked past him toward the hidden entrance. Jonas saw the shift in her expression and understood too quickly. "No," he said quietly. She ignored him. "What if the siren was not a warning, but an activation sequence?" she asked. Felix laughed once in disbelief. "That is not helping. What if the hum intensifies again before sunrise? What if the whole village ends up in the forest? What if someone opens that door without controls in place? Then that is on the state, not on you." "No," Sabine said. "Tonight it is on whoever is here." The words hung between them. For a long moment, no one moved. Even Petra had gone still, listening with her head tilted slightly toward the entrance as if the mountain were preparing to speak again. Then, from somewhere much deeper inside the hill, the hum pulsed once more. Not as violently as before, not enough to knock anyone off balance, but enough to make the moss at the threshold shiver. That ended the argument. Felix ordered one firefighter and Joseph Kessler to take Petra back under protest. Reba, too shaken to refuse, went with them as far as the track to help control the villagers still drifting near the basin. That left Felix, Sabine and Jonas alone at the entrance for all of 30 seconds before a new voice came through the trees. "You should have left it buried." The thick-necked forestry man stepped out of the dark with a flashlight in one hand and a bolt cutter in the other. Two other men followed at a distance, less certain, less committed. In the white beam, his face seemed older than it had earlier, its hostility now stripped of local bluster and exposed as something more personal. Felix's hand went at once to his service weapon. "Stay where you are." The man stopped, but only because he chose to. "You open that. You finish the village." Sabine recognized him fully now. Carl Brenner, one of the cooperative supervisors, not the owner of everything local rumor blamed, but close enough to power to speak as if he shared in it. "You knew it was here," she said. Carl's eyes moved to the seam in the hillside, then back to her. "I knew enough." "How much is enough?" "My father serviced drainage channels in this sector when he was a young man. He told me never to touch the old concrete, never to ask where the night trucks went, never to repeat the word Anlage where people could hear it." He lifted the bolt cutter slightly, not as a threat exactly, more like an object he had forgotten he was holding. He said some places are not abandoned. They are simply no longer admitted. Felix kept his voice level. "Did your father work for this facility?" Carl gave a bitter smile. Everybody worked for something in those years. Forestry office, civil defense, supply contracts, road crews. Men signed paper they did not understand because the pay was regular and the uniforms were polite. Sabine stepped closer. "And the phone," Carl looked at her as if deciding how much truth she had earned. "Replacement shipment, late 70s, maybe 1980. I saw the invoices when I was a boy because my father hid them in a flour bin, thinking my mother would not ask questions there. Agricultural padding, they said. Feed storage lining, but nobody lined feed sheds with military acoustic foam." Jonas straightened. "Then why keep the place hidden after the complaints started?" Carl's expression changed. "Because when they first shut the system down," he said, "the sound did not stop." No one spoke. Even the forest seemed to withdraw from the sentence. Sabine felt the tidy explanation begin to crack apart inside her mind. "What do you mean?" she asked. Carl looked toward the entrance, not at her. "My father went in once with a repair team after the official closure. He said most of the machinery had been powered down, cooling units gone quiet, main racks dead, but they still felt the pulse in the lower chambers. Not constant, intermittent, as if something had been taught into the structure itself." Jonas shook his head. "That's not how sound works." Carl gave him a flat, tired look. "No, it is how frightened men describe what they cannot explain." Felix lowered his weapon slightly, more from uncertainty than trust. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Tell whom?" Carl snapped, sudden anger breaking through. "The village, the district. Men who arrive, write reports and disappear. We told ourselves the hill was sleeping. We patched drainage, kept the old road closed, watched the older people when the hum came back every few decades, and prayed it would fade again." Sabine's mouth had gone dry. "Every few decades?" Carl nodded once. "Small episodes. Never this bad, not until now." The original belief that they were dealing with a failing Cold War server farm or abandoned stress simulation machinery collapsed in that moment. Whatever B-12 had once been, whatever its machinery had once done, the present event was no longer explained by simple residual operation. Either the facility still retained active systems no one understood, or the structure itself had become part of the phenomenon in a way the original engineers had never intended. Or worse, the site had been designed not merely to generate sound, but to store and shape it through the valley's geology. Sabine turned toward the entrance again. Suddenly, the concrete passage did not feel like the inside of a forgotten bunker. It felt like the throat of an instrument. Jonas saw it too. The granite basin, he said slowly. The foam, the concealed channels, the focusing geometry. This whole valley may have been part of the acoustic design. Carl looked at him without surprise. My father once called it a bowl. A bowl for what? Felix asked. Carl answered with visible reluctance. Stress conditioning, crowd breakdown, signal persistence. He used words he did not understand properly. He said the men from Stuttgart and Bonn were always arguing about whether the valley reflected too well. Sabine closed her eyes for 1 second. The square fountain, Lucas's wall, adults over 35 hearing it while younger people mostly felt pressure and nausea. It was not random sensitivity. It was selective coupling, age, bone density, prior sound damage, physiological thresholds, perhaps even old regional exposure patterns. The hum was not merely leaking from a machine, it was being shaped by terrain, water and buildings into something almost targeted. And if Carl's father had been right, the apparent source below was not the whole story. The village itself had become part of the system. Felix radioed district command again with a voice that had gone noticeably flat. Sabine barely heard him. Her mind was racing through a darker possibility. What changed now? She asked. Why is this cycle worse? Carl's face shuttered. Jonas answered before he could. Cooling failure, structural collapse, water ingress. Something down there shifted the coupling conditions. Or someone altered drainage, Sabine said. Carl looked at her sharply enough to confirm the thought before he spoke. The cooperative reopened the upper service road in spring, he said. New clearing route, drainage ditch cut wider after the storms. Felix stared at him. And you are telling us this now? Carl's anger returned at once. I did not know where the old channels ran. Nobody did. We only found concrete fragments and filled them. Sabine felt an awful clarity settle over her. A hidden acoustic complex beneath a granite basin. Aging dampening foam. Buried drainage architecture. A village above it. And recent landscape work that may have changed water flow or resonant pressure pathways just enough to wake the system into a new, more dangerous configuration. No wonder the hum had intensified. No wonder the village was coming apart. From below, very far down, there came a dull metallic impact. Not the siren this time, a repeated clang, slow, irregular, mechanical. Jonas lifted his flashlight. That's not random. No, Sabine said. The sound came again. Clang, a pause, clang. Felix moved to block the entrance. Nobody goes in, but Sabine was already staring past him into the corridor because mixed with the metallic impacts was another sound now, faint and impossible to mistake. Water, running somewhere below ground where, according to every comforting version of the story, nothing should still have been functioning at all. By dawn, Haldenkirch looked like a village that had survived a storm no one else would believe had passed through. Mist lay low over the square. The fountain trembled in small, disciplined pulses beneath the pale morning light. Windows that usually stayed shuttered until 7 were already lit. People moved in short, agitated paths across cobblestones and then doubled back as if they had forgotten why they had left their homes. No one seemed fully present inside his or her own body. Sabine had not slept. She sat in Mayor Reber's office with cold coffee turning bitter in a paper cup and watched the first police vehicles arrive from the district road one by one, too few and too late to feel like relief. Felix Maurer was in the corridor outside, giving the same briefing for the third time to men whose expressions shifted from skepticism to alarm as the details accumulated. Hidden entrance, unmapped facility, civilian disturbance, possible environmental hazard. No confirmed toxic exposure. Acoustic phenomenon ongoing. Each retelling made the truth sound less plausible. Jonas stood at the window with a tablet in his hand, reviewing the vibration data from the entrance corridor and the basin. He had dark half-moons under his eyes and a new restraint in his movements, as if he were beginning to understand that efficiency alone could no longer protect them from the scale of what they had uncovered. The low-frequency field spiked 3 times between 2 and 4:30, he said, then fell off slightly before sunrise. Sabine rubbed the bridge of her nose. Village-wide? Mostly concentrated in the old arc. Square, Church Lane, North Edge, near the Voss house. But the basin readings are still highest. She nodded once. No easy way back. That phrase came to her not as melodrama, but as a technical fact. Up to the moment they had opened the concealed west access and found the plaque, Sabine could still have imagined a controlled exit. A report to the district, a handover to state authorities, a formal role reduced to testimony and archived data. But the revelation of B12 had already moved too fast through too many frightened bodies. The village had seen the search parties in the forest. Enough people had heard Petra's ravings, seen the hidden scene, felt the pulse in the basin. Haldenkirch no longer possessed the ignorance necessary for orderly retreat, and Sabine no longer possessed professional distance. She had told herself at the beginning that she was here to identify a source, not to rescue a community from its own buried history. Yet sometime between the fountain's mathematically perfect ripple and the plaque in the corridor, the work had changed shape. Or perhaps she had. Mayor Rieber entered without knocking. He looked as though he had aged 5 years since the previous evening. His collar was damp, his eyes bloodshot, and the patient administrative tone that had defined him upon Sabine's arrival was nearly gone. The district wants temporary evacuation language prepared, he said. Not a formal order yet, just language. Of course they do, Jonas muttered. Rieber ignored him. At the same time, the cooperative is threatening legal action if I shut the upper forestry roads without state confirmation. Karl Brenner has changed his story twice in 2 hours. First, he admits his father knew of old service works. Then he tells the police he only repeated local gossip under stress. Because he is scared, Sabine said. Everyone is scared. Rieber planted both palms on the desk. Do you understand what happens if this becomes a national story? If newspapers arrive? If cameras show abandoned concrete under my forest and call it a Cold War human experiment? Sabine looked at him steadily. It may already be that story. He flinched, not from disagreement, but because he knew she was right. Then give me another one, he said. There was no answer to that, not an honest one. At 8 o'clock, Sabine and Jonas returned to the concealed west access with a smaller, more controlled team. Felix, 1 district engineer, 2 firefighters, and a medic waiting at the track. The area had been cordoned as well as wet forest and limited manpower allowed. Even so, Sabine could see villagers watching through the trees at the edge of the perimeter, drawn by the same ruined compulsion that had taken Petra into the basin. News in a place like Haldenkirch did not travel by facts. It traveled by posture, by glances, by the visible mismatch between authority and comprehension. The door stood where they had left it, half disguised by moss and now framed by yellow tape that looked absurd against stone and fern. Cold air still breathed from the opening. The interior pressure field remained stronger at the threshold than in the open forest, though slightly less violent than during the night. Felix handed Sabine a respirator mask. She looked at it, then at him. For dust? For being alive long enough to explain this later. That almost counted as kindness. They entered again. Daylight reached only a few meters into the passage before being swallowed by concrete and dark. Portable work lamps now cast harsh white circles over rust, cable brackets, and the old section numbers along the wall. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling seams. The place felt neither abandoned nor active in any ordinary sense. It felt interrupted, as though some previous system had lost its operators, but not its habits. The corridor sloped deeper than Sabine had realized during the night. Past the plaque, it bent left, then widened into a service junction with 2 blocked side passages. One had collapsed behind old steel mesh. The other had been packed with poured concrete sometime after its original construction. On the floor, the narrow-wheeled tracks continued through dust and mineral deposits toward the lower levels. The metallic clang they had heard during the night came again from below. Clang. Not loud, not close. A repeating mechanical knock at irregular intervals, always followed by the faint rush of moving water. The district engineer, a blunt man named Hoffman with tunnel experience and an expression permanently arranged for disappointment, crouched to inspect a wall seam. Hydraulics somewhere in the lower chamber, he said, or something trying to be. Old gate, valve, maybe a cooling line with intermittent pressure. Can it generate the hum? Felix asked. Hoffman shrugged. Not by itself. Sabine was already measuring wall vibration. The concrete ribs of the passage carried the low-frequency excitation in bands, stronger at some intervals than others, as if the corridor itself were acting as a tuned channel. When she pressed the contact sensor to one section near the curve, the waveform sharpened so cleanly that her throat tightened. "Jonas," she said, "compare this to the fountain data." He did, and the answer came quickly. "Same base periodicity," he said. "Modified by propagation, but yes, same family." Same family. A strange phrase, but accurate. The village fountain and this underground corridor belong to the same event, even if one expressed it through standing water and the other through reinforced concrete. They descended another level. The air grew colder. The walls changed too. Less service passage, more engineered containment. Sabine saw remnants of thick acoustic lining bolted behind steel grids, much of it rotted away or sagging from water damage. Not ordinary insulation. Purpose-built absorbent structures designed to trap broad-spectrum vibration and stop it from feeding back into the complex. So Carl Brenner's father had been right. They had not simply buried machinery in the forest. They had built a chambered acoustic system into the geology and then tried to contain its consequences. At the bottom of the stairwell, the corridor opened into a large antechamber with rusted control cabinets lining one wall and a shattered observation window overlooking darkness beyond. The glass was thick, layered, and crazed with old fractures. On the floor beneath it lay fragments of labeling plates, strips of degraded foam, and a waterlogged file box collapsed into pulp. Jonas knelt by one of the control cabinets and wiped grime away from its face. Rotary switches, frequency dials, range selectors marked in bands too low for ordinary audio testing. The labels were in German, technical, and bureaucratic. Population response index, behavioral persistence cycle, stress threshold modulation. Felix read them in silence, then looked away first. This was not civil defense, he said. No one contradicted him. Civil defense had been the public language. Safety, resilience, preparedness. What lay before them belonged to a different impulse entirely. The urge to study weakness under controlled conditions, perhaps in the name of security, perhaps in service of fear itself. Sabine stepped to the broken observation window and shone her light through it. The chamber beyond swallowed the beam at first, then shapes emerged, racks, rows of them, descending into a cavernous hall cut directly into granite. Some looked like server cabinets from an earlier generation, heavy and modular. Others were stranger, large acoustic baffles, suspended panels, cylindrical housings set into reinforced pits, conduit trunks descending into the floor. At the far end of the hall, half obscured by shadow, something vast and curved rose above the machinery like the inside of a stone amphitheater. A resonator. Not a simple one, an engineered acoustic chamber integrated into the rock face itself. Jonas came to the window and went very still. My God. Sabine did not answer, because the truth now was worse than the theories she had feared during the night. B-12 had not merely studied stress through sound, it had been built to generate persistent low-frequency fields across a landscape, then measure how human beings and structures responded over time. The village above was not incidental. Haldenkirch was part of the apparatus. The realization made her stomach tighten. For years, perhaps decades, the residents had lived above a test geometry they never consented to, inheriting the after effects without the language to describe them. The older generation did not hear the hum because age had cursed them with special fragility. They heard it because their bodies, their homes, their wells, and the valley itself had been conditioned by patterns older systems had taught into the place. And Sabine, with her damaged hearing, was not merely a neutral investigator. She was exactly the kind of person the system could still reach. She turned away from the glass too quickly and had to catch herself against the wall. Jonas saw at once. "You all right?" "Yes." It was a lie. Since entering the lower corridor, the old tinnitus had grown indistinguishable from the buried pulse around her. At moments, it seemed to split into two tones, the private electric thread she had carried for years and the broader subterranean pressure of B12 rising through concrete and rock. Then they would merge again, and she would no longer know whether the mountain was speaking or her own damage was answering. That uncertainty, once manageable, now became intimate and humiliating. She was losing the one advantage she had always preserved, her trust in measured reality over sensory chaos. Hoffman found the source of the metallic clang in a side service tunnel leading down toward the sound of rushing water. An old hydraulic control line fed into a valve assembly corroded almost beyond recognition. Every few minutes, pressure built, the mechanism struck, failed to complete its cycle, and fell back with a heavy knock. Cooling system overflow or drainage diversion, he said. Something below is taking water and not clearing it correctly. Sabine crouched beside the line. Condensation beaded on the pipe. The vibration meter responded violently when she held it near the housing. "If this valve keeps oscillating," she said, "it may be modulating the entire field." Jonas looked from the pipe to the dark hall beyond the observation glass. Then this is why it got worse after the drainage changes in spring. Maybe. She straightened slowly. Or maybe this is only the symptom nearest to us. Felix, already strained to the edge of patience, slammed one palm against the wall. "Enough with maybe. I need something actionable." Sabine turned on him before she meant to. "Actionable? Fine. The facility is no longer passively failing. Water ingress and hydraulic instability are interacting with whatever remains of the resonator system. Every pulse is being amplified by the basin geometry and fed into the village through structures, surfaces, and probably groundwater coupling. If the lower chamber floods unevenly or another pressure stage kicks in, the hum could intensify well beyond what the residents have already endured." Felix stared at her. "Can we stop it?" The honest answer was not one he wanted. "I don't know yet." He looked away in disgust, not at her, but at the day, the place, the entire inheritance of it. When they returned to the surface near midday, District Command had finally sent a regional official, 2 environmental technicians, and a media liaison who had arrived before any public statement existed. That alone told Sabine how quickly control was already slipping. A camera van had been turned back on the lower road. Social media clips from villagers, shaky videos of the basin, the fountain, Petra shouting in the dark, were circulating faster than any official denial could catch them. The village had begun to split into camps. Some older residents demanded immediate evacuation. Others accused the mayor and the police of staging an emergency to shut down forestry operations. The younger people, many of whom still could not hear the hum as the others did, oscillated between pity, anger, and frightened skepticism. Families argued in the street. A butcher refused to leave his shop because his father was certain the church crypt was safer than open roads. 2 teachers tried to calm a group of schoolchildren, asking whether there was poison under the mountain. Sabine walked through the square and felt the invisible weight of being watched, not as an outsider anymore, as a catalyst. She had brought instruments, questions, and a disciplined way of seeing. In return, Haldenkirk had given her a hidden door, a buried chamber, and the knowledge that a whole village might have been living inside the echo of a state experiment. None of that could now be put gently back where it had been found. At the guest house, Frau Brenner met her at the entrance with arms folded. "My husband has gone to Freiburg," she said. Sabine blinked. "What?" He packed a bag, took the car, and left before breakfast. "He says our son should not come home this weekend. He says the village is finished." There was no accusation in her voice. That was almost worse. Inside, Jonas was waiting at the dining room table with printouts from the lower chamber controls and a message open on his phone. "What now?" Sabine asked. He looked up grimly. The consultancy in Stuttgart called. Someone from the ministry contacted them, asking why one of their contractors is conducting unauthorized entry into a restricted federal legacy site. Sabine went still. Also, Jonas added, They said if this turns into a liability scandal, your firm will deny you acted under official instruction. There it was, the familiar architecture of institutional survival. Distance, disclaim, isolate. Her work, her reputation. Every case that depended on her judgment and credibility. All of it had just become negotiable in someone else's office. And still, that was not the worst part. Because as Jonas spoke, a new vibration moved through the wooden table between them. Both of them felt it. The water in the untouched glass at Sabine's elbow tightened into a precise ring. Then another. Then another. The hum was no longer staying in the square. It was spreading. By late afternoon, Haldenkirch had begun to resemble a place already remembering itself in the past tense. The roads were not yet blocked. The church bell still marked the hour, and smoke still rose from a few chimneys where people stubbornly kept to routine. But routine had become theatre. Beneath it, everything was shifting. Cars were packed hurriedly in some driveways and deliberately left untouched in others. Curtains twitched whenever police vehicles passed. In the square, the fountain no longer trembled only in brief episodes. The surface tightened at regular intervals now, each pattern forming with the same merciless precision, as if some buried metronome had taken control of the village's heartbeat. Sabine stood near the basin of the fountain with Jonas and watched the water settle into rings that were too exact to belong to weather, footsteps, or passing trucks. Same base periodicity, Jonas said, tablet in hand, but the envelope has changed. How? He turned the screen toward her. It is broadening, the signal still anchored in the same low-frequency family. But secondary harmonics are riding on it now. It's not just one clean pulse anymore, it's building structure. Sabine stared at the graph. He was right, what had first appeared as a disciplined subterranean hum was now becoming more complex, layering itself through the village in overlapping bands. A machine failing at random might grow noisier, dirtier, more chaotic. This was doing something more disturbing. It was organizing itself, or rather, Sabine corrected herself. The system was revealing more of its intended shape as its damaged restraints fell away. Pieces were finally connecting, not neatly, but with the cold inevitability of a mechanism assembling in reverse. The granite basin northeast of the village acted as a natural reflector. The quarry and hidden service works had been positioned to exploit that geometry. The acoustic foam had been used not only to dampen leakage, but to tune which structures received the strongest coupling. The lower hall in B12 contained not just experimental racks, but a resonant chamber integrated into bedrock. The hydraulic instability below, perhaps caused or worsened by altered drainage after the forestry roadworks, was reactivating or modulating parts of the system that should never again have interacted with the valley above. And Haldenkirch itself, its fountain, its walls, its groundwater, its older houses built directly on stone, had become an accidental extension of the hidden facility. The village had not merely been near the apparatus, it had always been inside it. That was the full shape Sabine could now see. Yet the most important proof was still missing. Not proof that B12 existed. The plaque, the corridors, the control labels, and the hidden entrance had already settled that. Not proof that the village was physically affected. The fountain, the wall readings, the basin, and the measured structural vibrations were stronger evidence than many environmental cases ever received. What was missing was the bridge between intent and consequence. They still did not know exactly what B12 had been built to do, whether Haldenkirch had ever been knowingly used as a live field environment, or whether the present event was a failed continuation of some original program. Without that proof, authorities could still retreat into the usual language. Legacy instability, historical anomaly, residual infrastructure effects, tragic but technical. Sabine needed the document, the log, the control record, something that would make euphemism impossible. Mayor Reber met them outside the municipal building with a face that told the story before he spoke. The district wants voluntary evacuation tonight, he said. Voluntary, Jonas repeated with open disbelief. They say a mandatory order would require more formal evidence of direct health hazard. Sabine looked around the square at the older villagers moving like exhausted ghosts between doorways. What do they call this? Reber did not answer. He was beyond defending anyone. Buses are coming from Freiburg. temporary shelter at a school gymnasium, and 2 guest facilities near the motorway. They expect resistance. They'll get it, Jonas said. Reba's eyes went to the fountain, then to Sabine. The regional official also wants access restricted to the bunker until federal representatives arrive. Tomorrow? They won't say. Of course not. Reba lowered his voice. There's more. A man has come asking for you. He says his father knew Dieter Lehmann. The name cut through the noise in Sabine's mind at once. Where is he? In the archive room. I did not know whether to trust him. You were right not to, she said. Let's find out. The man waiting below in the records room was in his 60s, narrow-faced, with the stillness of someone who had spent years learning not to waste speech. He wore an old green raincoat and held a leather document case so tightly under one arm that it might as well have been a rib. My name is Martin Lehmann, he said. Dieter Lehmann was my uncle. Sabine sat opposite him. You heard what happened here? He gave a brief nod. On the radio first, then from a former colleague in Freiburg who said engineers had found a concealed federal installation under a Black Forest village, and that the old complaints resembled a case my uncle used to mention when he drank too much. Jonas, standing near the door, shifted his weight. Your uncle investigated Heldenkirch in 1981. Yes, not officially for long. He was working then on environmental vibration disputes and had previous contract work with civil defense facilities. He came here after residents filed complaints that no one wished to classify properly. Sabine held his gaze. Did he find anything? Martin looked down at the document case. He thought he did, but afterward he stopped talking about it in any direct way. He became convinced his telephone was monitored. He burned notes. He drank more. My father said the village had frightened him. I did not believe that. Villages do not frighten men like Dieter. No, Sabine said quietly. What did? Martin opened the case. Inside was a thick envelope wrapped in oilcloth. He died in 1998, Martin said. A heart attack. After the funeral, my father found this hidden in the false bottom of his tool chest. He wanted it destroyed. I kept it. He placed the envelope on the table. Sabine did not touch it immediately. Some discoveries announce themselves with noise. Others change a room by existing quietly inside it. Martin unfolded the oilcloth and withdrew a stack of photocopied documents, several hand-drawn diagrams, and 1 cassette tape in a cracked plastic case. The top page bore a federal header, partly cut off by the copier. The visible lines were enough. Bundesamt für zivile Sicherung, Projektgruppe, akustische Belastungsreihe, Feldkopplung. Südwest field, coupling, southwest. Sabine felt Jonas go still behind her. What is this? Reba asked from the doorway. Martin answered without looking at him. The reason my uncle believed your village was never just collateral. They spent the next hour working through the papers. Most were incomplete. Some pages had clearly been copied in haste, with portions obscured or truncated. But the fragments were devastating in their consistency. B12 was described not simply as a stress laboratory, but as part of a field coupling program designed to study how low-frequency acoustic persistence could be shaped through terrain and built environments. There were discussions of valley resonance, structure-mediated propagation, and age-differentiated human response thresholds. One page referred to selective perceptual penetration among mature populations with previous industrial or wartime acoustic exposure. Another discussed the difficulty of obtaining uncontaminated civilian response data without local awareness compromising results. Heldenkirch was not named directly in the surviving copies. It did not need to be. A topographic sketch included in the packet matched the basin and village geometry almost perfectly. Reba sat down hard in the nearest chair and removed his glasses again. Civilian response data, he said, as if tasting poison. Jonas leaned over Sabine's shoulder. So they did use the village. Or intended to, Sabine said. At minimum, they modeled for it. Martin slid one final paper across the table. Unlike the photocopies, this one was original, handwritten, unsigned. Dated October 1981. The ink had bled in places, but the words remained readable. They say coupling was discontinued, yet the basin still carries residual patterning after shutdown. If drainage changes or lower chamber flooding alter the modulation field, population response could recur without active broadcast. If so, the village itself has become the memory medium. Sabine read it twice, then a third time. The village itself has become the memory medium. There was the bridge. Not perfect. Not an official confession with signatures and seals, but enough to complete the hidden architecture of the truth. B12 had not only transmitted sound, it had imprinted resonant behavior into the interacting system of geology, water, structures and bodies. The present disaster was not a machine simply turning back on. It was a buried field reawakened by altered physical conditions, with remnants of the old apparatus now amplifying and shaping the recurrence. Sabine looked up slowly. This is why shutting down machinery alone may not be enough, Jonas understood first. Because the valley is already tuned, yes. And the village houses, the fountain, the walls. And groundwater, Sabine said, anything coupled to the old field geometry. Reba stared at her. You are saying my village remembers what was done to it. The phrasing was imprecise, and yet, in a deeper sense, exact. Sabine chose her answer carefully. I am saying, the system may have taught its pattern into the environment. If so, parts of Haldenkirk are no longer only receiving the hum, they are helping reproduce it. No one in the room moved after that. Outside, a bus engine could be heard somewhere near the school road, idling in preparation for evacuation that many would refuse. Martin tapped the cassette tape with one finger. There's also this. Sabine looked at it. What's on it? My father listened once before hiding everything again. He said it was your Dieter Lehmann speaking into a recorder after he returned from the forest. He never played it a second time. Jonas found an old cassette deck in the records office storeroom, the kind kept for forgotten archive materials. It took several minutes to clean the heads enough for playback. While he worked, Sabine read the handwritten note again and again, feeling the pieces lock more tightly into place. Then the tape began. Static first, hiss, the low mechanical flutter of damaged magnetic ribbon. Then a man's voice, strained and too close to the microphone. Not equipment failure, not only that. Anyone saying that has either not been below or is lying to simplify it. The recording wavered. There was a sound in the background, not clear but broad and low, like distant pressure moving through a wall. They designed the lower chambers to interact with the basin. Reflective shaping, damped feedback, behavioral exposure measurements. If they ever field tested above, it would have been deniable by design. Sabine leaned closer. The voice continued, more agitated now. But the worst thing is not what they ran. It is what remains after. The old engineer from Stuttgart said stone stores pattern less than people imagine, and more than they admit. Water too. If the cooling galleries breach, if the flood channels open into the wrong bed, the tape crackled violently. Then Lehmann's voice returned in a whisper that made everyone in the room hold still. There is another chamber below the main resonator. They didn't show it on the plans they let me see. The real control is lower. Jonas looked at Sabine. Lehmann inhaled audibly on the tape. Somewhere behind him came a dull metallic blow. If anyone comes after me, tell them the proof is not in the entrance rooms. It is in the archive vault under level 3. Field logs, population tables, water modulation records, all of it. And if the hum comes back stronger, God help them, because it means the floodgates are cycling. The tape snapped into static. No one spoke for several seconds. Then from somewhere above them in the municipal building, glass shattered. The sound was sharp enough to reset everybody in the room. They ran upstairs. In the corridor outside the mayor's office, a clerk stood frozen beside the broken window with both hands over her mouth. Beyond the jagged frame, the square lay in chaotic motion. People were shouting. One of the evacuation buses had jackknifed near the fountain after the driver apparently lost control. Water from the basin was spilling over the stone lip, not from impact alone, but from violent vibration. The surface had become a hard, trembling skin, and in the middle of the square, older residents who had refused to leave were standing perfectly still, their faces turned toward the northeast forest as if listening to instructions only they could hear. Sabine stared through the broken glass, the tape's last words still burning in her mind. The real control is lower. The floodgates are cycling. At last they had the full shape of the hidden truth. What they still did not have was the one thing that mattered now more than ever. The final proof was in the lower archive vault beneath level 3, and the village above was beginning to answer whatever was waking below. The first real silence Sabine had known in Haldenkirch came only after the bus engine died. It sat twisted at an angle beside the square, one wheel up on the stone curve, windshield starred white where the driver's shoulder had struck it. Steam hissed from the front grille. A line of shattered safety glass glittered across the wet cobblestones like frost. Around it, the village was no longer moving as one frightened crowd. It had separated into stillness and panic. The younger residents rushed toward the bus, shouting, pulling at the folding door, trying to help the dazed passengers inside. But the older ones, the ones already worn raw by the hum, had become unnaturally quiet. They stood scattered around the square and along the lane toward the church, their bodies angled not toward the accident, but toward the northeast forest. Their faces were pale and emptied out, as if some deeper attention had pulled them inward and left only the outline of the person behind. From the broken mayoral window, Sabine saw one elderly man slowly remove his hat, not out of habit or courtesy, but with the mechanical gentleness of someone preparing to enter a sacred place. The hum had changed again. Even at this distance from the hidden entrance, she could feel the pattern organizing itself through the square. It no longer came as blunt pressure alone. Now there was sequence in it. Rise, hold, release. A low, broad pulse followed by a thinner shiver that seemed to run through stone and water rather than air. The fountain basin was trembling so hard that water spilled over its edge in rhythmic sheets. The floodgates, Jonas said behind her. Sabine turned. What? He was already pale from what they had heard on Lehman's tape, but now his face had gone almost bloodless. If the lower hydraulic system is cycling, it would explain the modulation bands. Water pressure changes. Chamber coupling. The signal isn't just stronger, it's being gated. Martin Lehman stood a few paces behind them in the corridor, the old cassette tape still clutched in one hand, as though he had forgotten he was holding it. Mayor Robert came up the stairs at the same moment from the square side, breathing hard, his coat wet and one sleeve torn where someone had grabbed him in the crowd. They're trying to leave the bus and walk into the forest, he said. Who? Sabine asked, though she already knew. The older passengers. The driver says they were calm until they reached the square. Then half of them demanded he stop. Two tried to open the doors while the bus was moving. Felix Maurer appeared behind Reber, his radio spitting fragments of panicked voices from the street below. District Command wants the perimeter widened, he said. The District Command also wants 100 impossible things. He looked at Sabine, then at Jonas. If there's anything down there that can stop this, we do it now. Sabine did not answer at once, because this was the decisive edge. Everything up to this point, measurements, suspicions, documents, the hidden corridor, the plaque, Lehman's tape, had led here. The real proof was below level 3 in the archive vault, and if the floodgates were cycling, then the lower hydraulic system was no longer only evidence. It was operational danger. Whatever still governed B12 lay deeper than the rooms they had seen. She looked once more through the shattered window. In the square, an older woman had stepped barefoot into the spilled fountain water and stood there with her eyes closed, as though listening with the soles of her feet. Then Sabine made the choice. We go back in, she said. Now, small team only. Felix nodded before anyone else could object. Me, you, Jonas. Hoffman, Sabine added. We need someone who can read old hydraulic infrastructure. Felix started to protest, then stopped. He knew she was right. Mayor Reber stared at her. And if you don't come back? Sabine met his eyes. Then evacuate whoever will still follow you and block every road into the valley. His expression changed, not into agreement, but into the grief of a man realizing the village had already crossed beyond any solution that looked like governance. I should come, he said. No, Sabine replied. You need to keep people above ground. That too was true. Reber belonged now to the living surface of Haldenkirch, to the shouting square, the stalled buses, the families arguing at car doors, the old people who might at any moment begin walking into the trees again. Beneath the hill waited something else. Engineering, memory, and the stripped remains of buried intent. They moved fast. Hoffman was found beside the west access, conferring bitterly with 2 environmental technicians and a federal liaison who had arrived just in time to be useless. The man objected at once when Sabine explained they were descending farther. "This site is under provisional federal review," he said, as if the phrase itself could hold back structural collapse and acoustic psychosis. Sabine stepped past him without answering. Felix did the same. Hoffman hesitated only long enough to pick up his toolcase. The hidden door breathed cold air into the rain-dark forest. Moss clung to its concrete flanks. Yellow tape snapped uselessly in the mist. Somewhere downslope, the square bell began ringing, not in orderly hour marks, but in jagged manual strikes. Someone above had taken to signaling with the only sound left that still belonged unmistakably to the village. Inside the corridor, the pressure hit at once. Not violently, but with a denser certainty than before. Sabine felt it in her teeth, her throat, the joints of her jaw. The old private tinnitus that lived in her hearing had become impossible to isolate. Sometimes it seemed to recoil in fear from the broader field around her. Sometimes it merged with it so completely that she could no longer tell whether she was carrying damage into the bunker or the bunker was carrying its damage into her. She did not say this to anyone. The passage lights they had rigged hours earlier still held, casting blunt white pools along the damp concrete. They moved past the plaque, past the blocked side corridors, down toward the antechamber with the shattered observation window. The low metallic clang from below had grown more frequent. Clang, pause, clang, water sounded louder too. No longer a hidden suggestion, but an active current somewhere beneath the lower chambers. In the antechamber, the air had changed. It was wetter, colder. One of the rusted control cabinets had begun vibrating so steadily that its door rattled against the frame. Hoffman crossed at once to the hydraulic service line they had found before and laid one gloved hand against it. "Pressure's rising," he said, "and not clearing." Jonas crouched by the broken observation window and shone his beam into the vast lower hall. The resonator chamber beyond seemed more visible now, or perhaps their eyes had simply learned how to read its scale. Rows of dead cabinets descended into dark. Acoustic baffles hung like blackened sails. At the far end, the curved granite structure rose from the chamber wall with the terrible elegance of a purpose too large to admit openly. "Level 3 has to be below that," Sabine said. Felix looked at the shattered floor below the window. "There's no stair here. There will be a service route." They found it behind one of the rust-stuck cabinets after Hoffman noticed a draft moving through the seam at its base. Together, he and Jonas levered the cabinet aside just far enough to expose a narrow metal door recessed into the wall. The paint had blistered away. A stenciled number remained. L3, Technic/Archive Technical/Archive. Felix laughed once, sharply, with no humor in it. Of course, the door was not locked. That was worse. When Sabine pulled it open, a steep metal stairwell descended into darkness, lit only by an intermittent red emergency glow from somewhere below. Water dripped through the steps into blackness. The hum changed in the shaft. It became less like external pressure and more like a slowly turning engine inside the skull. They descended single file. At the bottom lay a long corridor narrower than the ones above, lined with sealed storage rooms and broken cable trunks. Paper debris had blown along the floor and turned to paste where it met standing water. Several doors were stamped with technical labels: Modulations Archive, Protocol Raum, Hydraulische Steuerung. Most hung open. Level 3 had not been carefully abandoned. It had been left in haste, then drowned slowly. The archive vault stood at the end of the corridor behind a heavy steel door, warped by Ratin. Sabine knew it was the right place before she saw the sign, because the pressure field felt different there, tighter, as if the corridor itself were being pulled toward a point of memory. Jonas and Hoffman strained against the wheel handle until the seal broke with a wet internal groan. The smell that came out was old paper, oil, mildew, and something metallic beneath all of it, like the memory of blood in wet stone. Inside, shelving units leaned at angles where the floor had shifted. Boxes had collapsed into dark, pulped heaps. Water had once stood higher here and then receded, leaving brown mineral lines along the walls. Yet on the upper racks, above the flood mark, some material had survived. Sabine moved through the room with the concentration of a surgeon. Her flashlight beam found binders, logbooks, film canisters, sealed map tubes. Many labels had bled away, but others remained. Population responses, field harmonics, waterborne modulation trials, settlement profiles. The words were enough to make Felix stop reading after the first few spines. "Dear God," he said. Jonas lifted one file box from a high shelf and set it carefully onto a metal table. Inside were typed tables, carbon copies, and hand-annotated field sheets. The top page bore a grid of age ranges versus response categories. Irritability, sleep fragmentation, perceptual fixation, aggressive displacement, auditory ideation. At the bottom, handwritten in blue pencil, one note had been underlined twice. Phase response significantly higher in residents over 35, with prolonged industrial exposure, wartime acoustic history, or tinnitus-linked sensitivity. Sabine stared at the line until it blurred. There it was. Not suspicion, not inference. The final path to the truth. They had known enough to categorize suffering before it happened, known enough to predict that age, hearing damage, and older histories of sound exposure would make some populations more vulnerable than others, known enough, perhaps, to choose exactly the kind of village that would provide useful variability under cover of rural inconvenience. Jonas kept searching. Here, he pulled a bound ledger from the back of the box. The cover read Feldkopplung Südwest, Betriebsprotokoll. Sabine opened it with gloved hands. Daily entries, chamber pressures, basin reflections, surface anomalies, civilian observations coded by initials and sectors. In the margins, brief practical notes in several hands. Complaint cluster near square acceptable. Church bell interference useful for comparative masking. Older residents reporting motor or distant artillery description consistent. Local awareness remains manageable. Manageable. Sabine felt something hard and cold move through her chest. Felix had gone utterly still. Hoffman, who until now had treated the entire descent as a structural and hydraulic emergency, looked suddenly as though he wished the walls themselves would collapse and bury the evidence where no human face could be attached to it. At the back of the vault, half hidden behind a fallen shelf, Jonas found the map tube. Inside was the final architectural sheet, not the public plan, not the partial layout Lehman had been allowed to glimpse. This one showed the full lower system. Beneath the main resonator hall lay a secondary chamber carved directly into bedrock and linked to the river by controlled flood channels. The notations were technical, but their meaning came clear enough under Sabine's beam. Hydraulic modulation gates, emergency quench basin, resonant field interruption protocol. Interrupt, not shut down, not disable, interrupt. Because the system had apparently been designed on the assumption that once the field was coupled into the valley, no clean off switch existed, only disruption through massive forced flooding of the lower chamber. Hoffman swore. The metallic knock, those are the gate actuators trying to cycle. Can they still be opened? Felix asked. Manually, maybe, from the lower hydraulic station. Sabine traced the plan with one finger. The route led deeper than level 3, through a maintenance access descending beside the archive vault wall, then under the main resonator to a control station positioned near the river-fed channels. If Lehman had been right, and if the gates were now partially engaging on their own, then the whole system was balancing between reactivation and collapse. The final proof was in her hands, but proof alone no longer mattered unless it could be used. "We go lower," she said. Felix looked at her as if he had expected the sentence and still hated it. "We have what we came for." "No," Sabine replied. "We have what history needs. The village needs something else." Jonas had already seen it too. On the map, the lower station sat between two choices written in old engineering shorthand that became painfully legible once understood. Channel A, controlled flood release into Quench Basin. Channel B, bypass retention, flood the lower system and interrupt the resonant field at the cost of contaminating the groundwater route leading back toward Haldenkirch, or hold the flood and preserve the water, while allowing the field to continue cycling until the village could be fully evacuated, perhaps permanently. The moral choice had been waiting in the architecture all along. Destroy the mechanism and poison what remained above it, or spare the water and erase the community. Felix ran one hand over his face. We need command authorization. Sabine looked at the trembling corridor beyond the vault. Command is ours behind a machine built to outlast commands. As if in answer, the hum swelled. Not in the distance this time. Inside the vault itself, shelves shivered. Loose papers lifted and fluttered across the wet floor. The overhead emergency light strobed once, twice. Then, from somewhere below the floor, there came a deep grinding roar of moving water and metal under strain. Hoffman turned toward the wall where the lower maintenance shaft should be and shouted over the noise. The gates are trying again. A second later, the archive floor lurched beneath their feet. At the far end of the vault, behind the fallen shelf, a hidden panel sprang inward by several centimeters on its own. Cold black air rushed out from the shaft below, and with it came the unmistakable sound of the river entering the mountain. The shaft below the archive vault did not open like a door. It gave way like something losing an argument with gravity. The hidden panel behind the fallen shelf jerked inward another hand's width, metal shrieking against warped guides. And the black air rising from the gap turned colder at once. It carried the unmistakable smell of river water forced through old concrete, silt, iron, rot, and the mineral sting of stone, long sealed from daylight. Under that came another odor Sabine recognized from drowned machine rooms and flood-damaged industrial sites. Oil, not fresh oil. Old lubricant broken down by years of heat, damp, and neglect. The hum swelled through the archive vault until the metal shelving around them began to sing in thin, sympathetic tones. Loose pages skated across the wet floor. One binder slid from a tilted upper shelf, struck the concrete, and burst open, spilling tables of coded human response data into water that had already begun to seep beneath the door. Jonas caught the wall with one hand. Sabine, I know. She heard her own voice as if from too far away. Because the moment had stopped belonging to theory, there was no longer any meaningful distance between the buried truth and its consequence. The proof lay all around them now. Logbooks, population tables, flood protocols, the hidden shaft, the river forcing its way into a system designed to modulate sound across the valley. And whatever final choice B-12's engineers had left for emergencies had now been handed, absurdly and obscenely, to the wrong century and the wrong people. To them. Hoffman shoved the fallen shelf clear and widened the panel opening with both gloved hands. Beyond it, a narrow maintenance stair dropped into darkness, lit only by intermittent red emergency bulbs far below. Water noise rose through the shaft in surges, not continuous flow. Gate cycling, pressure changes, interruption attempts. The whole lower structure sounded like an old heart trying to decide whether to beat or fail. Felix Maurer gripped the recovered operations map so hard the paper creased under his fingers. We go down, verify the gate controls, and get out. Hoffman laughed once in disbelief. There is no verify and get out from a hydraulic station that has already started moving on its own. Sabine took the map and looked again at the lower layout. The emergency quench basin sat beneath the main resonator chamber and linked directly to the river-fed flood channels. If Channel A could be forced open fully, the lower chamber would flood hard and fast. The notes were explicit about the intended result. Interrupt the resonant field by submerging the active infrastructure and collapsing the modulation geometry. But the same notes warned of environmental contamination and uncontrolled outflow into upper groundwater routes if the seal condition had degraded. 50 years of degradation had certainly not improved anything. Jonas read over her shoulder. If the lower chamber floods, it stops the system, or destroys enough of it to stop propagation, Hoffman said. And if it doesn't, Felix asked, then we drown underground for the sake of an academic distinction, Hoffman replied. Sabine folded the map once and slid it into the waterproof sleeve of her field bag. We still have to reach the station. The archive floor shuddered again. This time, the movement was strong enough to buckle water in a spreading ring around their boots. Somewhere above, far above, the lower edges of Heldenkirch would be answering it already. In the fountain, in cellar walls, in pipes, in the chests and teeth of the older residents still listening to the forest. She thought of the square, of the barefoot woman in the spilled water, of the bus passengers turning their heads in one obedient motion toward the northeast basin, of all the years in which people had mistaken buried engineering for nerves, bad blood, sleeplessness, age. No easy way back. That had been true before. Now there was no way back at all. They descended. The maintenance stair was narrower than the corridors above and coated with condensation that made every metal tread treacherous. Red bulbs buzzed weakly behind wire cages along the wall, some lit, some dead. With each level down, the sound of water intensified until it was no longer heard as background, but inhabited the entire shaft, rushing through concrete and steel with the force of a second weather system inside the mountain. Sabine's respirator did little against the damp cold. The hum moved through her mask, her jaw, her ribs. Her tinnitus had ceased being a separate affliction. Down here, it felt absorbed, enlisted, as though the damage she had carried for years were now resonating with the architecture around her. At moments, the sensation became almost unbearable. Not pain exactly, but the horror of losing the boundary between one's own nervous system and a machine's dying field. Jonas saw her hand tighten once on the rail. "You need me to take point?" he asked. No, but the answer cost her more breath than it should have. At the bottom of the shaft, the stair opened into the lower hydraulic station. It had once been a control room. Now it looked like the drowned remains of a war between water and engineering. Consoles stood half-submerged behind safety rails. Pressure gauges were fogged from within. Thick wheel valves rose from the floor beside pipe trunks as broad as tree boles. Through an armored viewing slit in the far wall, Sabine could see black water hammering through a concrete channel beyond, white with turbulence where it struck the gate housings. The room vibrated continuously, not with the sharp chatter of ordinary mechanical failure, with something deeper, slower, almost orchestral in scale. The hydraulic pulses, the low-frequency field, and the residual resonator geometry were all interacting here in one terrible system. Hoffman crossed at once to the nearest control pedestal, wiping corrosion from the stenciled markings. Main flood release, bypass retention, manual override. Felix joined him. Can it still be controlled? Hoffman tested one lever and swore as it refused to move. Maybe, but not from here alone. Jonas had gone to the armored slit and shone his light through the water spray. There are 2 gate assemblies, one's half open already. Sabine stepped beside him. The lower chamber beyond the viewing slit was vast enough to make human intention seem ridiculous. The river entered from a reinforced side channel high in the rock, dropped into a roaring control basin, and split against 2 immense steel floodgate housings before descending toward the resonator foundation below. One gate sat partially engaged, shuddering under pressure. The other remained closed, but its manual chain mechanism had begun to twitch with each hydraulic surge, as though waiting for one final instruction. If both gates opened, the lower resonator hall would take the full force of the river. If they remained as they were, the partial surging would continue modulating the acoustic field in pulses. Perhaps hours, perhaps longer, depending on how much of the old machinery still endured. Felix looked from the gates to Sabine. "Say it clearly." She did. "If we force the flood release, we likely destroy the lower chamber and interrupt the field." "And the water?" She held his gaze. "Contaminated. Oil, degraded acoustic compounds, whatever corrosion products and residues B12 has been storing for half a century. It will move into the local groundwater path. Maybe not forever, but long enough to kill the village as a place people can live safely. And if we don't, then we hold the water and preserve the aquifer route for now," she said. "But the hum continues. The coupling may intensify again. Evacuation becomes permanent anyway, only slower and less honest." No one moved. The choice stood among them with brutal clarity. Flood the underground facility and poison what remained of Haldenkirch's future, or leave the machinery and shape terrain active long enough to erase the village by evacuation, psychosis, and memory. Jonas spoke first, too quietly. "Either way, the village is finished." "No," Sabine said. He turned toward her. "The village as an address may be finished either way," she said. "That is not the same as leaving this thing alive." Felix looked at the rushing water through the slit. "You're asking me to choose contamination over a chance to stabilize." I'm telling you, stabilization is the lie this place was built on. The words surprised even her. But once spoken, they felt exact. B12 had always promised control, of sound, of fear, of populations, of thresholds, of what could be measured and shaped in secret. Stabilization was only the euphemism engineers and states used when they wanted damage to remain manageable and deniable. Holdenkirch was what deniable damage looked like after 40 years. Hoffman interrupted, voice sharp. Decision now, pressure's climbing. If the second gate self-cycles while we're in here, we lose manual authority. Felix closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them again, they had changed. He was still frightened, still too young for this inheritance. But something in him had hardened into responsibility. If we flood, he said, I want the record preserved. All of it. The ledgers, the population tables, the plans, the tape. No one buries this again. Sabine nodded once. Jonas said nothing. He simply moved to the manual chain housing on the far side of the room and began pulling free the safety pins that still held the emergency override assembly in place. There was no more debate. The mechanism required 2 actions in separate points of the station. Hoffman had identified them immediately, released the seized secondary actuator at the gate housing, and engaged the manual override wheel at the control pedestal to force both channels into full flood alignment. It was exactly the kind of emergency design that assumed a team, clear communication, and functioning machinery. They had none of those in full. Felix took the override wheel with Hoffman. Jonas went to the chain housing. That left the secondary actuator line at the viewing channel, the one that had to be physically unjammed near the water itself. Sabine knew before anyone said it who would have to do it. Felix turned toward her at once. No, there's no one else with the sensor rig. We don't need a sensor rig. We need someone who can still stand. She almost smiled, but there was no strength for it. That would still be me. It was not entirely true. The hum in the lower station was making her vision pulse at the edges. Nausea rose and fell in time with the hydraulic surges. Her ears no longer felt like organs. They felt like cavities in a building under stress. But she also understood the field in a way the others did not. She could feel when the pulses aligned and when they slipped. She could tell when the actuator strain rose before the gauges even caught up. Or she told herself she could. Perhaps that too was the mountain using what damage she already carried. She clipped a safety line to the wall ring, pulled on heavier gloves, and stepped through the narrow service hatch leading to the actuator platform. The noise outside the station was immediately worse, not louder in a simple sense, broader, more total. The river channel roared below, throwing cold spray into her face. Steel housings vibrated under her boots. Ahead, the jammed secondary actuator rod jerked in short, violent motions, unable to complete its stroke because decades of corrosion and debris had locked the guide bracket half closed. Sabine crouched against the gate housing and set the contact sensor to the bracket. The waveform flared. Each time the hydraulic pressure rose, the rod struck the obstruction, failed, and threw a modulation pulse back into the chamber. This was one of the beating hearts of the hum now. "See," Jonas shouted from inside the station. "What do you need?" 2 more surges. She listened with her fingertips through the metal, waiting for the pattern. 1 rise, 1 fall, then the next came harder. Now! She rammed the pry bar Hoffman had handed her into the corroded guide gap and levered with all her weight. The first attempt only jarred her shoulders and sent pain up both arms. On the second surge, the rod slammed again, steel shrieking. On the third, something cracked. Not the bracket, the platform beneath her. A rusted support plate gave way at the edge. Sabine's left foot plunged through to the ankle. She pitched sideways toward the channel. The safety line snapped tight and slammed her against the gate, housing hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. For a second, the world went white, then red, then narrow. She heard Jonas shouting her name from far away, heard Felix too. Felt cold water strike her face. Her shoulder exploded with pain where the harness had caught her. And beneath all of it, moving through the steel and river like a giant animal shifting in sleep, the hum surged into one long rising band. Sabine forced air back into her chest and dragged herself upright against the housing. Her left leg shook with pain but held. The bracket was still only partially free. If she stopped now, the gate would continue to pulse. If she fell, the river would take her under the resonator foundation where no one would get her back. She set the pry bar again. This time, she did not wait for the surge. She put every last controlled thing in herself. Anger, exhaustion, terror, the private humiliation of damaged hearing, the memory of the square, of Lucas's wall, of Petra's hands on the trembling ground, into one brutal leverage stroke. The corroded guide snapped open. Inside the station, Hoffmann shouted, "Now, turn it now!" Felix and Hoffmann heaved on the override wheel. Jonas yanked the chain release. For one impossible second, nothing happened. Then the second gate assembly engaged. The sound was monstrous. Not an explosion, a colossal mechanical acceptance. Steel moving because it had been ordered to move and could no longer refuse. Through the viewing slit and spray, Sabine saw the flood channel widen as black river water hurled itself through both gate housings toward the lower chamber. The floor of the station lurched. Every light went white, then dark. Emergency red returned in a stuttering pulse as the lower hall beyond took the full force of the river. The hum did not stop immediately. It screamed. That was the only human word for what the field became in its death throes. Not a sound through ears, but a total body cry rising through concrete, steel and water all at once. Sabine dropped to both knees on the actuator platform, hands over her head, though there was nothing to shield. Somewhere inside the station, metal shelves collapsed. Glass shattered. Jonas shouted something she could not hear clearly, then the rising band broke. The pressure in her teeth vanished. The platform still vibrated under the violence of water, but the deeper organizing pulse, the old-shaped intelligence of the field, was gone. Gone. Sabine knew it before the instruments could confirm it. She also knew the cost before anyone said it aloud. The floodwater rushing through the lower chamber had torn black sheets of degraded acoustic lining from the walls. Oil floated in sudden rainbows under the red lights. A bitter chemical smell rose even through river spray. Whatever toxic remnants B12 had kept buried for decades were now being carried downstream into the groundwater routes that fed Haldenkirch above. Jonas reached her first, clipping a second line to her harness and hauling her back through the service hatch with Felix's help. The moment she reached the station floor, she nearly collapsed. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Blood ran through one torn glove where the pry bar had ripped skin from her palm. Her left shoulder had begun to stiffen into something deeper than bruising. Felix caught her before she hit the wall. "Stay with me. I'm here." But her voice sounded strange, thin and far away. Hoffmann was staring through the armored slit into the drowning lower chamber with the expression of a man who has just seen a necessary crime committed correctly. "It's done," he said. Jonas looked at the oily water. "And the village?" No one answered at first, because the answer was in the smell already rising through the station, in the flood protocol on the map, in the knowledge that stopping the hum had meant releasing everything else the mountain had hidden. Sabine leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for 1 second too long. In that darkness, she saw not the chamber, not the gates, but Haldenkirch 1 year from now. Abandoned houses, poisoned wells, empty roads returning to moss, the forest reclaiming all the stories people would never finish telling. When she opened her eyes, Felix was still holding her upright. Above them, very faintly through concrete and stone, came a sound none of them had heard in days. Nothing, no pulse, no hidden pressure, only river, machinery dying, and the ordinary aftermath of destruction. The hum had stopped, and Haldenkirch, in the same moment, had lost whatever future it still had. When they emerged from the west access, the forest no longer felt as though it were listening. That was the first difference. The mist still hung between the fir trunks. Rain still clung to moss and stone. Far below, the square still held the wrecked bus at an angle beside the fountain. Yet the invisible pressure that had turned every surface in Haldenkirch into an instrument was gone. Sabine knew it in the same way one knows the sudden absence of pain after long fever. Not as relief exactly, but as a vacancy so abrupt it felt suspect. Jonas reached the threshold first and stopped dead, one hand still on the steel frame. Felix came up behind him, then Hoffmann. Sabine followed last, dragging her left leg slightly, her shoulder held too rigidly by the damage from the harness catch. Cold air hit her face, and for a moment she nearly mistook the simple emptiness in it for safety. Below the slope, the basin lay quiet. Not calm, quiet. No tremor moved through the moss. No patterned vibration rippled in the puddles. The trees stood in ordinary weather again. Sabine could hear individual droplets falling from branch tips. A woodpecker struck somewhere deeper in the forest, thin and clean and real. Such small, ordinary sounds now seemed indecently beautiful. Then the smell reached them, a bitter, oily smell riding up through the wet earth and cold air from the channels beneath the mountain. Hoffmann swore softly. "It's already moving." Felix grabbed his radio at once and began barking for containment teams, environmental control, sealed access, groundwater barriers, anything and everything the district did not yet have in place. His voice was steadier than it had been below, but only because the task had changed shape. Underground, he had been a man standing before a moral machine. Above ground, he could once again pretend logistics might save somebody from what had already been chosen. Sabine looked past him toward the square. People were gathering there in stunned clusters. Some of the older residents who had stood, turned toward the forest, now seemed to be waking from a bad dream. A woman sat abruptly on the curb and began to sob into both hands. An old man looked around as if surprised to find himself outdoors. The barefoot woman from the fountain had stepped back onto the cobbles and was staring at the water running off her feet with blank, embarrassed concentration, like someone returning to consciousness in a room she did not remember entering. The hum had not merely stopped. It had released them. But not all release felt like rescue. By the time Sabine and the others reached the square, Mayor Ribert was already there beside the crashed bus, directing people away from the fountain with a voice gone raw from overuse. He turned when he saw them, and in the half-second before anyone spoke, Sabine watched him search their faces for the answer he was afraid to want. "It stopped," he said. "Yes," Sabine replied. Reba closed his eyes. The relief that moved through the square was not immediate or complete. It traveled unevenly, like warmth returning to numb hands. People looked up, looked around. Some began asking one another if they still heard it. Others shook their heads too quickly, as if afraid that naming silence might call the sound back. A middle-aged man laughed once in disbelief and then, just as suddenly, bent over and vomited into the gutter. Then Reba looked at Sabine again, and he smelled the oil on her clothes. "What did it cost?" he asked. She did not answer at once, because the truth, spoken in the open square with villagers watching, would change the shape of the next hour and every hour after it. Yet to soften it now would only repeat the crime B12 had already committed so well for decades. Translate damage into manageable language until nobody knew when exactly betrayal had begun. So she said it plainly. "We forced the flood release to interrupt the lower chamber." Reba's face did not move. "The hum is over," Sabine continued, "but contaminated water is already entering the groundwater routes. We don't know full concentrations yet, but nobody should drink local water. Nobody should use wells. The village has to be evacuated fully." The words traveled through the square faster than any loudspeaker could have carried them. No local water. Evacuated fully. A murmur became outrage, disbelief, prayer, accusation. Frau Brenner put both hands to her mouth and backed against the guest house door frame. Joseph Kessler, still holding Petra by the elbow as though she might dissolve if he let go, stared at Sabine with an expression that was not hatred and not gratitude, but some harder thing trapped between them. One of the timber cooperative men shouted that it was impossible, that city people had poisoned the village themselves to prove a theory. Another old woman sank onto the church steps and began reciting a psalm under her breath. Then Karl Brenner pushed through the crowd. His coat was unbuttoned, his hair wet with mist, his face sharpened by the same grim certainty that had followed him in the forest. He stopped a few paces from Sabine and took in the oil streaks on her jacket, the blood drying on one torn glove, the stiffness in her shoulder. "You opened the floodgates," he said. Sabine met his eyes. "Yes." "And ruined the water?" "Yes." Something in the square seemed to lean toward the exchange. Karl laughed once, but it was the hollow laugh of a man recognizing the oldest pattern in the world. Hidden power leaves, and ordinary people inherit the wreckage. "So this is how it ends," he said. "The state builds its machine, buries it, lies about it, and when it wakes up, we drown our own village to shut it off." Felix stepped forward. That machine was already killing. Karl cut him off without taking his eyes from Sabine. I know what it was doing. His voice rose. My father knew, Hartung knew, Lehman knew, and every man who found the edge of the truth either hid it, drank it, or died with it, because they all believed there would still be time later to fix it cleanly. He pointed toward the northeast forest. There was never going to be cleanly. The words struck harder because they were true. Sabine felt the weight of the recovered ledger inside Jonas's waterproof case, the tape in Martin Lehman's pocket, the plans still folded in her own field bag. Proof existed now in sufficient quantity to indict history, bureaucracy, and design. But proof did not neutralize consequence. It only made denial more difficult, and already denial was fighting back. The first federal vehicles arrived just after dusk. Dark cars, sealed windows, men and women in weatherproof coats speaking in clipped low voices into phones they seemed almost afraid to remove from their ears. With them came more district police, environmental technicians, and a media containment officer who tried to establish a perimeter in a village where everyone now understood that the perimeter had always been inside them. Orders moved quickly: secure the access point, isolate the square fountain, prohibit water use, establish off-site shelter, restrict all comment until central review. Central review, a phrase old enough to smell like the corridor walls below. One federal representative, a silver-haired woman with the deliberate calm of someone trained to reduce human catastrophe into legal categories, asked to speak privately with Sabine in the municipal office. She introduced herself only as Dr. Anja Vetter from a historical infrastructure response unit. That title alone told Sabine everything and nothing. You have materials recovered from the site, Vetter said once the office door closed. Yes, we will need them transferred immediately into federal custody. Sabine, sitting stiffly because her shoulder was rapidly becoming unusable, studied the woman's face. It was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was administrative. For preservation, Vetter added, and chain of evidence. Sabine almost smiled. Preservation, she repeated. Vetter chose not to react. The public situation is unstable. Incomplete or misinterpreted material could produce serious long-term consequences. It already has. Engineer Keller, I am asking you to recognize the difference between establishing accountability and triggering uncontrolled national scandal around partially decontextualized Cold War research. There it was at last, the strongest opposition, not a villain in a bunker, not a raving villager in the basin. Language, containment, reframing. The state's ancient instinct to admit damage only under the terms least dangerous to itself. Sabine looked at the woman for a long time and thought of the ledger entries. Manageable. Complaint cluster acceptable. Civilian response data. Words sharp enough to wound even decades later. Then she reached into her field bag. Vetter's gaze sharpened fractionally. Sabine set one item on the desk. Not the ledger, not the plan, only a photocopied maintenance schedule from the upper corridor. A start, she said. Vetter stared at her. That is not all. No. Where are the rest? Sabine held her gaze. Somewhere no single office can bury them again. That too was now true, because while the federal convoy had been driving through mountain roads and drafting careful language, Jonas had already done what Sabine knew he would do once he saw the first containment posture settle into place. He had scanned everything salvageable in the records room with Martin Lehman's help. The tape had been digitized, the plans photographed, the population tables and field logs copied twice over. One set was already being transmitted through a remote archive server in Stuttgart by a colleague Jonas still trusted from his university days. Another sat on two encrypted drives in separate hands, one with Martin, one hidden where even Sabine did not yet know. It was not a perfect defense, but it was enough to prevent neat disappearance. Vetter stood very still behind the mayor's desk. Do you understand what you're doing? Yes, Sabine said, ending the experiment. For the first time, the woman's expression changed. Not much, just enough to show that beneath the procedural calm, there was genuine anger now. Some of these materials may be incomplete. Then let history survive incomplete. Without context, they may implicate living institutions unfairly. Sabine thought of Ingrid Albrecht's dead brother, of Petra on her knees in the basin, of Lucas cutting open his own bedroom wall. of villagers walking barefoot toward the forest because the ground beneath their homes had been taught to speak to them in a language of pressure and fear. Context, she said quietly, has had 40 years. Veta did not threaten her. Threats would have been too obvious, too melodramatic, too human. She simply left the room with the cold dignity of someone already planning more sophisticated methods of pressure. By nightfall, Haldenkirch was under full evacuation. Not everyone went willingly. Some elderly residents had to be coaxed, carried, or sedated lightly by medical staff because they refused to leave houses that had suddenly become both dangerous and holy in their grief. Others packed with strange composure, as if they had expected for years that one day the village would finally ask them to surrender all the things their parents had built and their children had no use for. Cars rolled out along the valley road in a patient line. Buses filled again, this time under police escort. The square lights burned over water. Nobody would drink again. Sabine stood near the fountain with her arm in a temporary sling and watched people leave. The basin was still now, completely still. No ring touched the surface except ordinary rain. Petra Kessler passed with Joseph toward the bus line. She moved slowly, wrapped in a blanket, her face blank with the exhaustion that follows survival when survival has not yet become belief. As she drew level with Sabine, she stopped. For a moment, Sabine thought she might accuse her. Instead, Petra looked down into the unmoving water and whispered, "I thought it was calling me because it knew me." Sabine said nothing. Petra's eyes did not leave the fountain. But it only knew how to use what was already tired. Then she walked on. It was perhaps the truest sentence anyone had spoken in Haldenkirch. Near midnight, with the village nearly emptied, the federal convoys sealed the west access road and posted guards at the square. Environmental teams began testing runoff and wells, their faces hidden behind masks and headlamps. Reba sat alone on the church steps for a long time before Sabine finally joined him. The bell above them was silent. "They will call it a legacy infrastructure incident," he said without looking at her. "Yes. They will say we acted out of caution. Yes. And the people who lost their homes will be given forms." Sabine watched the last bus lights disappear down the valley road. "Yes." Reba folded his hands between his knees. "Will the truth survive?" She thought of Veta's calm face, of the copied logs moving now beyond official custody, of Jonas somewhere in the dark guesthouse kitchen sending one more encrypted package into the world, of Martin Lehman holding his uncle's voice at last, in a form that could not so easily be locked away in a false-bottom toolbox. "Enough of it," she said. That was the most honest promise available. An hour later, as Sabine prepared to leave the square for the last time that night, shouting erupted near the municipal building. Two federal officers were arguing with Jonas. One had a hand on his coat sleeve. Jonas, usually dry and precise, even under stress, looked ready at last to swing at somebody. Sabine crossed the cobbles before pain could advise against it. "What happened?" Jonas held up his phone. On the screen was a national news homepage. No leaked documents, no exposure of B12, no field logs. Instead, a brief official statement had already been published. Historical water contamination event in former service infrastructure near Haldenkirch. Preliminary evidence suggests localized psychogenic distress amplified by rumor and emergency response strain. Further review pending. Sabine read it once. Then again. Psychogenic distress. Rumor. There it was, the burial attempt already underway, efficient and bloodless. Jonas looked at her with fury and disbelief braided together. "They're doing it again." Sabine raised her eyes from the screen to the emptying square, the still fountain, the abandoned bus, the dark road leading into the forest where the hidden entrance now sat under guard and law and carefully chosen nouns. "Yes," she said. Then in the same moment, Jonas's phone vibrated. A new notification. He opened it. The expression on his face changed. Someone had released the first scanned ledger pages anyway. Not all of them, just enough. Population response categories, age thresholds, the line about older residents describing the sound as motor or distant artillery. And beneath the images, already spreading faster than the official statement could catch, a headline no ministry had written. "The village under the frequency." The truth had been challenged. but it had not been buried, not yet. A year later, the apartment was so quiet that Sabine sometimes woke just to confirm that silence still existed. It was on the third floor of a post-war building in Stuttgart West, on a street where the trams whispered at a distance and neighbors closed their doors with practiced care. Nothing about the place was romantic. The windows were narrow, the parquet creaked in two predictable spots. The kitchen was small enough that one had to decide in advance what not to reach for. Yet after Haldenkirch, its ordinariness had become a kind of luxury she never named aloud. She lived there with measured routines and an altered body. Her left shoulder had healed badly at first, then adequately, then not at all in the simple sense she had hoped for. It still stiffened in wet weather. The nerve damage along the collarbone sometimes lit up at night with a thin private fire. The cuts on her palm had disappeared into scar tissue. Her hearing, which had already carried years of injury before the mountain took its share, had become more complicated than worse. Some tones now seemed to recede from her more quickly than before. Others arrived too sharply, too near, too intimate. The tinnitus remained. It always would, but after the flood release below B12, Sabine no longer thought of it only as damage. It was also a border she had once crossed and come back through. Not everyone in Haldenkirch had come back in the same way. The official story never fully stabilized, despite every effort made to reduce it into something palatable. There had been statements, corrections to statements, inquiries that changed names midway through their own proceedings, and hearings whose most revealing sections were repeatedly deferred on the grounds of national archival sensitivity. Ministries denied direct lineage to the responsible project groups. Former agencies claimed structural discontinuity. Lawyers argued over whether the surviving documents proved live civilian testing, negligent field coupling, or merely a catastrophic legacy failure of Cold War infrastructure whose human consequences had been badly anticipated and then badly managed. But once the ledger pages escaped, they kept escaping. More scans surfaced, then the tape, then the hydraulic plan. Journalists from Hamburg, Berlin, and Frankfurt spent months tracing procurement routes, military-adjacent research contracts, civil defense euphemisms, and budget lines that appeared under agricultural or geological headings and ended in blankness. Former archivists spoke carefully, then less carefully. A retired engineer from Bonn gave one interview before retracting it in legal panic. Ingrid Albrecht, who had once sat in the records room and said villages preferred manageable stories, became the sort of witness institutions hate. Elderly, articulate, furious, and impossible to intimidate without looking obscene. And still none of it repaired the village. Haldenkirch was closed within 6 weeks of the flood release. At first, the language was temporary. Restricted water use, full remediation pending, controlled access only, but environmental tests confirmed what the bitter smell in the forest had already promised. Hydrocarbon residues, degraded industrial compounds, and trace acoustic treatment materials had entered the local water path deeply enough that recovery could not be guaranteed on any humane timeline. Some houses might have become habitable again years later, after excavation, replacement, sealing, and the stripping away of any illusion that life there had continuity. But by then the village as a social body had already been broken open. People relocated outward in widening rings. Freiburg, Offenburg, apartments near cousins, rental units above shops in towns they had once driven through without interest. Temporary housing became semi-permanent. Semi-permanent became ordinary. The school closed. The bakery did not reopen elsewhere. Frau Brenner's guest house remained locked through winter and then was sold in spring to an entity linked to federal land management. Reba resigned 3 months after the final evacuation order and refused every television request that followed. Karl Brenner testified once angrily before a committee in Berlin and then disappeared back into private work, with the exhausted discretion of a man who had spent too much of his life standing beside buried truths. Petra Kessler spent several months in treatment and then moved with Josef to his sister's place near Tübingen. Lukas Voss sat his exams somewhere outside Karlsruhe and, according to one brief message that reached Sabine through Ingrid, had become interested in architecture for reasons he himself found difficult to explain. Martin Lehmann kept his uncle's original tape in a bank vault after the digitized copies spread beyond anyone's control. Jonas left consultancy work entirely. That was perhaps the least surprising ending of all. 3 months after Haldenkirch, he accepted a position with an independent research consortium focused on environmental infrastructure disclosures and refused every corporate contract that required confidentiality clauses broad enough to smell like history. He and Sabine still spoke, though not always regularly. Some experiences do not strengthen friendship in obvious ways. They alter its chemistry. Between them, there was now an understanding so specific, it could never be recreated socially. The knowledge of what it means to hold proof in wet hands while a system tries to decide whether to outlive you. As for Sabine, she testified more often than she slept that winter. Committees, panels, expert consultations, press requests she declined, and then on 2 occasions accepted because silence had begun to feel too useful to the wrong people. She never turned theatrical, never raised her voice, never gave institutions the comfort of calling her unstable. She answered questions with frequencies, field coupling models, hydraulic modulation, structural resonance, population thresholds, archived evidence, and the plain statement that halting the system had contaminated the water, and that contaminating the water had still been the less dishonest choice. That sentence made people uncomfortable. Good, she had eventually learned, was not the word for decisions like that. Necessary was not much better. What remained was accuracy. The hum would have continued. The village would still have been lost, only more slowly, with more private damage and more time for bureaucracies to treat suffering as a statistical side effect. Flooding B12 had not saved Haldenkirch in the sentimental sense. It had ended the experiment before it could go on pretending to be weather. Not everyone forgave her for that. Some never would. There were letters, most grateful in ways that made her uneasy, a few furious. One anonymous note, written in a shaky hand, accused her of murdering a village to prove that engineers are never satisfied until the world breaks exactly along their diagrams. She kept that note longer than the others because it was, in its own damaged way, a recognizable form of grief. She had, after all, become one of the people who chose which loss would become real. That knowledge did not fade. It settled. On certain evenings, especially when rain pressed low over the city and the tram cables hummed faintly above the street, Sabine found herself remembering the square fountain in Haldenkirch with almost unbearable clarity. Not the violence of it, the discipline. The mathematically perfect rings forming in water before anyone had language strong enough to hold what they meant. That had been the most terrible feature of B12 in the end. Not the noise, not even the suffering, but the degree to which intelligence had been applied to deniability. A thing can be monstrous and still remain bureaucratically neat. That was the true engineering lesson of the mountain. The public inquiry dragged on through winter into spring. Some records were confirmed authentic, others remained contested. Names surfaced and disappeared again behind legal walls. One ministry issued an apology so abstract that it seemed almost proud of its own incomprehensibility. Compensation packages were announced, revised, delayed, expanded, attacked, and finally distributed in amounts that satisfied no one and reassured only those never forced to live under the hidden frequency. The abandoned village itself passed under layered jurisdiction. Security fencing went up around the northeast basin and west access sector. Monitoring wells were sunk. Drone surveys were conducted. The church bell was removed quietly one Thursday morning and stored off-site after structural experts warned that the tower foundations had been compromised by long-term vibration. That detail affected Sabine more than the newspaper's larger headlines. Villages are not only houses and water lines, they are the repetition of certain sounds at expected hours. Remove those, and even memory starts to lose its footing. In late summer, Sabine drove once toward the Black Forest and then turned back before reaching the Valley Road. She told no one. She was not avoiding the place. Not exactly. She simply understood that return is sometimes a vanity disguised as closure. Haldenkirch no longer needed witnesses standing in its emptied streets trying to harvest wisdom from broken masonry. It had already given enough. So she remained in Stuttgart and kept her life narrow in the useful ways. Work, but less. Better clients. No institutional consulting without full disclosure clauses. Fewer trains, more walking, coffee in the same place on Thursdays. Physical therapy exercises she almost always forgot until pain reminded her. Sleep that was still irregular but no longer hunted. News alerts she muted except when old names resurfaced. She bought 3 new glasses over the year because she kept leaving them in impossible places while reading inquiry documents too late into the night. She began, without planning it, to prefer water from glass bottles because tap water now carried too much implication. And in that apartment, one ordinary evening in early November, she stood alone in the kitchen while rain touched the windows and the city moved around her with the merciful indifference of a place not built as an experiment. She had just come home from a long hearing where a ministry lawyer had spent 40 minutes suggesting that the phrase population response tables did not necessarily imply unauthorized civilian exposure. Sabine had answered each question without visible anger and returned exhausted enough to resent the precision of her own restraint. She set down her bag, switched on the kitchen light, and opened a bottle of mineral water from the shelf. The cap crackled. The glass was clean. The room smelled faintly of lemon soap and old wood. Nothing in the evening asked to become symbolic. That was why what happened next reached so deeply. Sabine poured the water into a tumbler and set the bottle aside. For a second, the surface of the glass lay smooth and ordinary beneath the kitchen light. Then it tightened. One ring formed, clean, perfect. Too precise for a passing tram, too centered for a tremor from the street, too measured for imagination once seen. Sabine did not move. A second ring appeared inside the first, then a third, not chaotic, not random, mathematically exact. Her hand remained on the counter edge, her breathing slowed rather than quickened. The old tinnitus lifted its thin electric line through the left side of her hearing, familiar as scar tissue. Outside, a car passed on wet pavement. Somewhere above, a neighbor dropped something small and metallic. The building settled. The city went on being a city. The water in the glass became still again. Sabine stood there a long time without touching it. Perhaps it was nothing. A structural vibration from the tram lines carried unusually through old masonry. A resonance from plumbing. A coincidence cruel enough to borrow the shape of memory. She knew all the reasonable explanations. She had built a life on them. And yet reason had never been the same thing as innocence. At last, she drew the glass closer and looked into it as if it were a document that had chosen for 1 second to stop pretending. A year earlier, she had stood beneath a mountain and ended a hidden system at the price of a village. She had exposed enough truth to keep the dead machinery from being renamed into safety. She had done everything an adult conscience can do once history hands it a lever. Still, one question remained, more haunting because it would not behave like a legal or technical problem. Had B12 died beneath Haldenkirch, or had it only taught the world more quietly than anyone yet understood how memory travels through water, stone, and damaged human hearing? Sabine left the glass untouched on the counter and switched off the kitchen light. In the dark, the apartment returned to its careful silence. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment with the word silence and subscribe for the next mystery.